Every culture on Earth, separated by oceans, mountains, thousands of miles and thousands of years, somehow tells the same story. A world existed before this one. It was destroyed. And we are the survivors, or the descendants of survivors, living in whatever came after. The Sumerians wrote about it on clay tablets. The Greeks wrote about it in philosophical dialogues. The Hindus built an entire cosmology around it. The Norse sang about it in their sagas. The Maya carved it into stone calendars. The Hopi passed it down through generations of oral tradition. None of these people could have talked to each other. The Sumerians and the Hopi were separated by an entire ocean and thousands of years, yet somehow they're all describing the same basic idea. Before this world, there was another one, and it ended in fire, or flood, or ice, or darkness. So what's going on here? Is this just coincidence? Is it something buried in the collective human psyche, some shared fear of endings that shows up in every culture independently? Or is it possible, and I know how this sounds, that these stories are memories? Not literal history exactly, but echoes of something real that happened so long ago the details got twisted into myth. But the core event stayed intact, generation after generation passing down a warning. This has happened before. It can happen again. That's what we're exploring today. 7 civilizations, 7 traditions, 7 different descriptions of a world before our world. Ancient Mesopotamia and the flood that predates Noah by over 1,000 years. Plato's Atlantis, a warning disguised as a philosophy lesson. The Hindu Yugas, cycles of creation and destruction stretching across millions of years. Zoroastrianism's deadly winter that nearly ended humanity. The Maya's precise dates for when previous worlds were wiped out. Norse Ragnarök, and what happens after the gods themselves die. And the Hopi traditions describing not one but multiple worlds that came before this one. Before we get into it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I check these comments constantly. It's wild seeing Tokyo at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, London somewhere in between, all listening to the same story about worlds that ended long before any of us existed. And if you're enjoying this, the best way to support what I do is to find the show on Spotify. Listen there, and if you like it, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Links in the description. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Not our beginning, the one before it. Number 1 on our list takes us to Mesopotamia, the land between 2 rivers, where writing itself was invented, and where the oldest surviving flood story in human history was carved into clay thousands of years before anyone had heard the name Noah. Most people know the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. The hero Utnapishtim, warned by a god, builds a massive boat, saves his family and a collection of animals, and survives a flood that wipes out everyone else. It sounds almost identical to the biblical story, and that's not an accident. But here's what most people don't know. Gilgamesh wasn't the original. It wasn't even close to the original. Buried underneath that famous epic is an older, stranger, and honestly more unsettling version of the same story. A version that doesn't just tell you a flood happened. It tells you why the gods decided humanity needed to be erased in the first place. And the reason has nothing to do with sin or wickedness or moral failure. It has to do with something far more mundane and, if you think about it for more than a few seconds, far more disturbing. Humanity was destroyed because it made too much noise. This story is called the Atrahasis, and it comes from Babylonian tablets that predate the version of Gilgamesh. Most people are familiar with by centuries, possibly longer. The tablets are fragmented, chunks of clay broken, and scattered across archaeological digs, painstakingly reassembled by scholars piecing together a narrative that's been buried for roughly 4,000 years. And what that narrative describes is nothing like the moral flood story we're used to. It starts, strangely enough, with labour. In the beginning, according to the Atrahasis, the gods didn't want to work. Digging canals, farming, maintaining the infrastructure of the world, all of it was exhausting, thankless labour that the senior gods didn't want to do themselves. So they created humanity specifically to do it for them. Humans weren't made in some grand act of divine love. They were made as a workforce, cheap labour for tired deities who wanted someone else to dig their irrigation canals. And for a while, this arrangement worked exactly as intended. Humans multiplied. Humans worked, the gods relaxed. But there was a problem nobody had anticipated. Humans kept multiplying, and multiplying, and multiplying within a few generations. According to the myth, the human population had exploded across the land between the rivers, filling every available space. And here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. The tablets describe the noise, not metaphorical noise, not a poetic description of sin or chaos. Actual, literal noise, the clamour of human civilization. So many people living so close together that the racket of daily life, footsteps, voices, children, tools, animals, arguments, celebrations, all of it blending into a constant, unrelenting roar that reached all the way up to the heavens and disturbed the god Enlil's sleep. Think about that for a second. The oldest flood myth in human history isn't about divine punishment for wickedness. It's about a god who couldn't get a decent night's rest because there were simply too many people making too much noise down below. Enlil, furious and sleep-deprived, goes to the other gods and essentially says enough. This has to stop. And what follows is almost comedic if it weren't for what happens next. The gods don't immediately reach for a flood. First, they try smaller solutions. They send plague to thin out the population. When that doesn't work, or works only temporarily before humanity bounces back and starts multiplying and making noise all over again, they try drought. They shut off the rains, hoping starvation will solve their problem. Humanity adapts, survives, and keeps growing. The gods try again with famine. Humanity endures that too. Every single time, the human population dips, recovers, and eventually returns to exactly the same problem. Too many people, too much noise, too much life crammed into too small a space. It's worth pausing here to notice something, because it's easy to read this as just an ancient story and miss how strange the underlying logic actually is. This isn't a myth about humans behaving badly and being punished for it. There's no crime here in the way we usually think of crime. No corruption, no violence against the gods, no theft of sacred fire. The offence is simply existing in large numbers, reproducing successfully. Filling the available land, it's almost as if the story is grappling with something the people who told it had actually experienced or feared. Overpopulation strained resources, settlements pressed right up against the limits of what the rivers and the soil could support. Whether that reflects a real memory of population pressure in early Mesopotamian city-states, we can't say for certain. Myths aren't transcripts, but it's an odd detail to invent from nothing, and once you notice it, it's hard to unsee. So the smaller solutions fail, one after another, and Enlil grows more and more frustrated. Eventually, the gods arrive at a final, drastic decision. If plague won't work, if drought won't work, if famine won't work, then the only remaining option is total annihilation. A flood so complete it erases every trace of humanity from the earth, and lets the gods start over from nothing. Not a warning, not a chance for humanity to change its ways, just a decision made in a divine council chamber to wipe the slate clean because the experiment had grown too loud, too crowded, too uncontrollable. But here's where the story takes the turn that would echo for thousands of years afterward. Through Babylonian temples, through Assyrian libraries, eventually reshaping itself into the version everyone knows from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and, further down the line, into the story of Noah. Because not every god agreed with Enlil's decision. One god, Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, looked at the plan to erase humanity entirely and decided he wasn't willing to let that happen without a warning reaching at least one person. Enki couldn't openly defy the decision of the divine assembly. The gods had sworn an oath. No one was supposed to warn humanity. So he found a loophole. In the older versions of the story, he speaks not directly to a man, but to the wall of that man's house. A reed wall, a flimsy barrier made from bundled stalks. The kind of thing that could barely keep out wind and dust, let alone hide a secret from a god. And through that wall Enki gives the warning. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor is called Utnapishtim. His name is usually translated as something like, "he found life," which is already a clue that this isn't a normal human being by the end of the story. He lives beyond the edges of the known world in a place no ordinary traveller can reach. Gilgamesh meets him only after crossing deadly waters in search of the secret of immortality, and when Gilgamesh asks how Utnapishtim escaped death, Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. It begins with a message that has to be disguised. Enki, called Ea in the Babylonian version, tells the reed wall to listen carefully. Then he gives instructions that are startlingly practical. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon your possessions. Save your life. Not a temple, not a fortress, not some tiny raft for one terrified family. A boat, enormous, sealed, engineered to survive a world-ending storm. And the dimensions in the Gilgamesh version are strange. The vessel is described as a giant cube, equal in length, width and height. 7 decks, 9 internal sections, a structure divided into compartments, loaded with supplies, waterproofed with vast quantities of bitumen. The ancient Mesopotamians knew bitumen well. It seeped naturally from the ground in parts of the region and was used to seal boats, bind bricks, and protect buildings from water. So even in a story about gods destroying the world, the details are grounded in the technology people actually understood. Utnapishtim doesn't just throw together a wooden vessel in a panic. He hires workers. He gathers materials. He feeds the builders. The text describes beer, oil, meat, and wine being distributed during construction, almost like a massive public work project. Imagine the scene from the perspective of everyone watching. Their neighbour has suddenly demolished his own house and started building an impossible wooden mountain in its place. He tells them something cryptic about leaving the city. He keeps working. The boat keeps rising, and nobody apparently understands what is coming. Then Utnapishtim loads it. His family goes aboard. His possessions go aboard. Skilled craftspeople go aboard. And then come the animals, described in the epic as the seed of all living things. That phrase matters. The boat isn't only a lifeboat, it's a container for renewal. Outside it, the old world is about to vanish. Inside it is the raw material for whatever world comes next. This is one of the reasons the story feels so hauntingly familiar. The flood isn't simply destruction, it's destruction paired with preservation. The gods are wiping the slate clean, but one god has quietly hidden the future inside a sealed wooden box floating on black water. And then the storm arrives. The Gilgamesh epic does not describe gentle rain falling for 40 days and 40 nights. Its flood is more violent than that. The sky itself seems to break apart. Thunder god Adad roars from the clouds. The land is swallowed by darkness. Winds tear across the earth. Even the gods are terrified by what they have unleashed. They flee upward, cowering near the heavens, described as huddling like dogs against a wall. That detail is easy to miss, but it's remarkable. These are not all-powerful gods calmly watching their plan unfold. They are frightened by the scale of their own weapon. The flood becomes bigger than its makers expected. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm rages, wind screams. Water covers everything. Human beings disappear so completely that, in one chilling line, the text says they have become like clay. Not drowned people, not survivors clinging to rooftops. Clay. The substance from which humanity had been made in Mesopotamian myth, reduced back into mud. Then, on the 7th day, the storm stops. The sea grows quiet. Utnapishtim opens the boat and looks out across a world that has become flat and empty. No cities, no fields, no roads between settlements. Just water and silence and death. He falls to his knees and weeps. Eventually the boat comes to rest on Mount Nisir, generally identified somewhere in the ancient Near East, though its exact location remains uncertain. The vessel stays there for days. Utnapishtim waits, because getting off too early would mean stepping into a world that may still be entirely underwater. So he sends out birds, first a dove. It finds nowhere to land and returns. Then a swallow. Same result. It circles over the water, finds no resting place and comes back. Finally he releases a raven. The raven flies away, sees that the waters are receding, and does not return. That is the signal. Land is emerging. The reset is ending. Utnapishtim opens the boat. The people and animals step out. And the first thing he does isn't build a new house or claim a new piece of land. He makes a sacrifice. He burns an offering to the gods. The gods gather around the scent, and the text is brutally honest about why. With humanity gone, nobody had been feeding them. Nobody had been making offerings. Nobody had been maintaining the relationship between gods and people. The divine council had nearly destroyed the very beings who sustained its own rituals. So Enlil, the god who wanted humanity erased, arrives and is furious to discover survivors. But the other gods confront him. Why destroy everyone? Why not use a less absolute punishment? Why not send wild animals, disease, famine, anything but a flood that annihilates the entire human world? It's a strange moment of divine regret. Not exactly an apology. Ancient gods rarely apologize, but an admission that total destruction had been excessive. And then Utnapishtim receives the most extraordinary reward imaginable. He and his wife are granted a life unlike that of ordinary humans. They are made immortal, not because Utnapishtim conquered death, not because he discovered some hidden medicine. He survives because he was warned, because he followed instructions, because he built the boat in time. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If one man and his family could be saved, how many others might have been saved if the warning had not been kept secret? And that question takes us away from the myth for a moment, back toward the people who copied it onto clay. Because Mesopotamia was not some abstract landscape of gods and monsters. It was a place where water gave life. Water carried trade, water built cities, and water could erase a settlement with terrifying speed. Because in southern Mesopotamia, water was never just scenery. The Tigris and Euphrates made civilization possible. Their annual floods carried fresh silt onto the fields. Their channels connected cities by boat. Their marshes supplied fish, reeds, birds, and grazing land. Without those rivers there is no Sumer, no Akkad, no Babylon. But the rivers were also unpredictable. The Nile rises and falls with a rhythm that ancient Egyptians could anticipate. The Mesopotamian rivers were different. Their floodwaters came down from mountains far to the north, fed by snowmelt and seasonal rain in places most farmers along the lower Euphrates would never see. A clear sky over a city did not mean safety. The disaster could already be moving toward them, a wall of water carrying broken trees, mud, animals, and the remains of villages upstream. And the land itself made the danger worse. Southern Mesopotamia is incredibly flat. In some areas the slope is so slight that a river can shift its course over time, abandoning one channel and cutting a new one somewhere else. When levees broke, water did not simply rush past and disappear. It could spread for miles across fields and settlements, turning farmland into a shallow inland sea. Mud brick houses, the basic architecture of the region, were especially vulnerable. Water dissolved walls, roofs collapsed, storage jars broke, grain rotted. A community might survive the first rush of floodwater, only to face hunger and disease in the weeks that followed. For people living there, a flood did not need to cover the entire planet to feel like the end of the world. Imagine a city surrounded by flat horizon in every direction. Your world is the fields you can walk across, the canals you can travel, the neighbouring settlements your traders know. Then water covers all of it. The roads vanish. The boundary between river and land disappears. Every familiar landmark is gone. If your city is destroyed, and every nearby city is underwater too, what possible evidence would you have that dry land still exists beyond the horizon? That is one reason the Mesopotamian flood stories matter so much. They are mythological texts, filled with gods, divine arguments, and impossible events. But they grew out of a landscape where catastrophic flooding was not imaginary. It was part of lived experience, and archaeology suggests that some ancient Mesopotamian cities really were struck by enormous floods. At sites including Shuruppak, Kish, and excavators found thick layers of water-laid sediment buried between levels of human occupation. In simple terms, archaeologists dug down through remains of houses, pottery, tools, streets, and workshops, and then found bands of clean silt or clay deposited by floodwater. Above those layers, people eventually built again. For decades, this seemed like dramatic confirmation. Was this the flood? Had archaeologists found the physical scar left by the disaster remembered in the ancient stories? The answer is more complicated. The flood deposits at these cities do not all date to exactly the same period. Some are separated by centuries. Some may represent local river floods, not one single catastrophe. Mesopotamia was a world of shifting channels and repeated disasters, so multiple cities could have suffered devastating inundations at different times. There is no archaeological evidence that one flood covered all of Mesopotamia at once, let alone the entire world. But that doesn't make the stories less interesting. It may make them more realistic. Instead of preserving a memory of one literal global deluge, the traditions may reflect something deeper. Generations of communities living with the knowledge that water could erase almost everything they knew. A city could fall, a dynasty could end, fields could disappear under silt. Survivors could rebuild somewhere else and tell their children about the time the waters came. Over centuries, separate disasters can merge in collective memory. One terrible flood becomes the flood. One ruined city becomes the whole human world. A local survivor becomes the ancestor of everyone who came after. And Mesopotamian texts preserve exactly that kind of memory. The Sumerian king list, a strange document that mixes history, royal propaganda, and myth, divides time itself into two eras: kingship before the flood and kingship after the flood. Before the flood, it says, rulers reigned for impossibly long periods, sometimes tens of thousands of years. Then the flood swept over the land. Afterward, kingship descended from heaven again, beginning a new sequence of cities and dynasties. That is not a historical timeline in the modern sense. Nobody should read those reign lengths as literal records, but the structure is revealing. the flood is treated as a dividing line, a break so total that the world on one side is almost unrecognizable from the world on the other. Before it, an age of semi-mythic rulers. After it, the human political order begins again. This is what a reset looks like in ancient memory. Not necessarily the destruction of every human being on Earth, but the destruction of continuity. The old order is gone. Its cities are buried. Its rulers belong to a time beyond ordinary counting. The survivors inherit a damaged world and have to begin again. There are also older Sumerian flood traditions, preserved only in fragments, where the survivor has a different name, Zu-Sudra. Later Akkadian-speaking cultures told related versions with names like Atrahasis and Utnapishtim. The names changed. The language changed. The empires copying the tablets changed. But the core image survived for more than 1,000 years: divine anger, overwhelming water, a chosen survivor, and life beginning again after destruction. That persistence is remarkable. Clay tablets are fragile. Cities burn, libraries collapse, scribal schools disappear, and yet copies keep being made. A story that begins in Sumerian survives into Akkadian. It passes through Babylonian hands. It becomes part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Centuries later, flood traditions appear again in the Hebrew Bible, in a form that shares striking features with the Mesopotamian versions: a warning, a great vessel, preserved animals, birds sent out over receding waters, and a sacrifice after land returns. That does not prove every version came from one single original event. Stories travel, they adapt. Religious ideas are reshaped for new audiences and new gods. But it does show that the flood was one of the great enduring story patterns of the ancient Near East. And maybe that is because it answered a question people could not escape. What do you do when the forces that sustain your world are the same forces that can destroy it? The rivers fed Mesopotamia. They also drowned it. The gods were supposed to protect the city. They could also abandon it. Civilization itself was a triumph of canals, dikes, labour, planning, and cooperation. But one season of extreme water could expose how fragile all of that really was. The flood story gave that terror a shape. It turned disaster into a narrative with a beginning, a survivor, and an ending. It said that even after the waters rose, even after the old world vanished, something could be preserved. Knowledge, family, seeds, animals, the possibility of starting again. That is why the Mesopotamian flood comes before Gilgamesh in more ways than one. It predates the most famous version of the epic, but it also reaches beneath it, into the oldest fears of the first cities, that civilization can be built from mud and water and return to mud and water almost overnight. And once you start looking for that pattern, you find it far beyond Mesopotamia. Not always as a flood, not always with an ark, but again and again ancient cultures describe worlds that ended, survivors who remained, and humanity beginning over in the ruins. Number 2. Plato's Lost Atlantis. Few ancient stories have become more famous, more argued over, or more distorted than this one. Say the word Atlantis, and most people picture a drowned super-civilization. Crystal towers, advanced machines, secret maps, a lost continent waiting beneath the ocean. But the original story is much stranger than the legend that grew around it. Atlantis appears in only 2 surviving works from ancient Greece. Both were written by the philosopher Plato, probably around 360 BC. Their names are Timaeus and Critias, and if you want to understand why people still search for Atlantis more than 2,000 years later, you have to begin with an uncomfortable fact. There is no earlier known text describing Atlantis. No Egyptian inscription that names it. No Babylonian tablet. No Minoan record. No collection of old Greek poems that gives us a second version. Plato is our source. Everything starts with Plato. That does not automatically mean he invented every detail. Ancient authors often built stories around real places, inherited traditions, travellers' tales, and memories of disasters. But it means we have to be careful. We are not comparing dozens of independent accounts. We are listening to one of history's greatest writers tell a story through layers of narration. And Plato makes those layers very clear. In Timaeus, the story begins in Athens, not in Atlantis. A man named Critias tells Socrates that he has heard an extraordinary account passed down through his family. Critias says his grandfather heard it from his own father. His father had heard it from Solon, the famous Athenian lawmaker and poet. And Solon, according to Critias, learned it during a visit to Egypt. That is already a chain stretching across centuries. Plato, writing in the 4th century BC, is describing Critias, who says he heard a story about Solon, who supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests, who claimed to preserve records from an age unimaginably older than Greece itself. It is like being told that a family story has survived through generations, except the family story involves a forgotten war between Athens and an island empire from before recorded history. According to Critias, Solon travelled to the Egyptian city of Sais in the Nile Delta. Sais was real. It was an important Egyptian city and later became the capital of Egypt during the 26th dynasty. Greek visitors did travel to Egypt. Greek merchants, soldiers, and intellectuals had contact with Egyptian society for centuries. So the setting is not fantasy. Plato places his story in a world his audience would have recognized. In the story, Solon speaks with priests at the temple of the goddess Neith, whom the Greeks identified with Athena. He starts discussing ancient Greek traditions, including the famous flood of Deucalion, the Greek survivor of a great deluge. Then an elderly Egyptian priest interrupts him. The priest tells Solon that Greeks are always young in spirit. Not young because they lack intelligence, young because they have forgotten their own deep past. The Egyptians, he says, have preserved records through repeated catastrophes. Greeks have not. And this is one of the most important details in the whole Atlantis account. Before Plato introduces the lost island, he introduces the idea of world resets. The priest says that humanity has been destroyed many times in different ways. Fire from the sky, great floods, disasters that wipe out populations and erase knowledge. Afterward, the survivors are often uneducated people living in mountains or isolated regions. They remember only fragments, writing disappears, cities vanish. The arts and sciences have to begin again. Think about what that means. A civilization does not need every human being to die for history to be lost. Destroy the archives, break the trade networks, scatter the population. Kill the people trained to read, build, govern, navigate, calculate and preserve records. A few survivors may remain, but they are survivors without the systems that made civilization possible. To the next generation, the previous world becomes myth. This is exactly the pattern we have been following. The old order is broken. A disaster creates a boundary between before and after. Those who come later inherit stories, ruins, maybe a few names. But they do not inherit continuity. Plato's Egyptian priest puts it bluntly. Each time a catastrophe comes, people begin again as if they were children. And then he tells Solon that Athens was not always the city. Solon knew. Long before the classical Athens of philosophers, temples, assemblies, and war with Sparta, the priest claims there was an older Athens, an Athens from 9,000 years before Solon's time, that would place it roughly 9,600 years before Plato's own era, near the end of the last ice age. Now, we need to pause here. There is no archaeological evidence for a literate, city-building Athenian civilization operating 9,000 years before Solon. Athens was not a major urban centre at that date. Greece was inhabited by hunter-gatherer communities, not the organised state Plato describes. So if Plato intended this as literal history, the timeline conflicts sharply with everything archaeology currently shows. But the number matters because it makes the story feel ancient beyond normal memory. For Plato's audience, 9,000 years was not just old. It was almost incomprehensibly old. It placed the events before Greek cities, before Greek kings, before the heroic age, before the Trojan War, before the genealogies and legends that usually marked the edge of the known past. The priest tells Solon that this ancient Athens was disciplined, virtuous, and well-ordered. It was a society built around courage, moderation, and public duty. Its citizens were not obsessed with luxury. They did not seek empire for its own sake. They defended their freedom and the freedom of others. This is not accidental. Plato spent much of his life asking what a just society should look like. In works like The Republic, he imagines an ideal state governed by wisdom rather than greed. So when he describes ancient Athens, he is not giving us the messy, crowded, politically divided Athens of his own time. He is giving us something closer to a philosophical model. A city as Plato thought it ought to be, and against that ideal Athens he places its opposite, Atlantis. The Egyptian priest says that beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the place we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, there was an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. To Greeks, Asia usually meant Asia Minor, modern Western Turkey, not the entire continent. Even so, Plato's island is enormous. It sits at the threshold of the known ocean, beyond the narrow passage where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic. For Greek sailors, that boundary had enormous symbolic power. The Mediterranean was a sea of familiar ports, islands, colonies, and rival powers. Beyond the pillars lay ocean, the vast and uncertain outer water that wrapped around the world, and somewhere beyond that boundary, Plato says, rose an island kingdom of astonishing wealth, power, and ambition. Not yet a sunken ruin, not yet a mystery for divers and satellite images. At this point in the story, Atlantis is alive. Its people are organized. Its territory is vast. Its rulers command resources on a scale that would have seemed almost impossible to Plato's listeners. And the question hanging over everything is simple. Was Plato describing a lost memory of the ancient world? Or was he constructing the perfect enemy for the perfect Athens? Atlantis did not begin as a ruined civilization. It began as an empire on the move. According to Plato's account, its rulers had expanded outward from their island homeland and brought large territories under their control. They held islands. They held parts of the continent beyond them. They had ships, armies, wealth, and access to resources that made smaller states look insignificant. And eventually, they turned toward the Mediterranean. This is where the story stops being a description of a distant, exotic kingdom and becomes a warning. Atlantis was not destroyed because it was weak. It was destroyed at the moment it became too powerful, too confident, too hungry for control. Its leaders assembled a vast force and attempted to conquer lands on this side of the sea. In Plato's version, nearly every Greek state gave way before the Atlantean advance. All except ancient Athens. The old Athenian state, the one supposedly preserved in Egyptian memory, stands alone against the invaders. It fights not only for itself but for peoples already threatened by the empire. And somehow, against an opponent with vastly greater resources, Athens wins. It is the kind of victory that sounds almost impossible. A small disciplined society defeats a rich expansionist superpower. Courage overcomes luxury. Self-control defeats greed. A city devoted to the common good survives, while an empire built on domination collapses under the weight of its own ambition. But Plato does not let Athens enjoy that victory, because then comes the reset. He says that after the war there were violent earthquakes and floods. Not a slow decline, not a long famine, not a dynasty collapsing over generations. A sudden, violent break in the world. In the space of one terrible day and one terrible night, the Athenian warriors were swallowed by the earth, and Atlantis, the entire island, disappeared beneath the sea. One day, one night, an empire that had threatened whole regions of the world was gone. That sentence is the engine behind 2,000 years of obsession. In a single day and night, it gives the story its terrible speed. If Atlantis had faded away over centuries, it would be interesting. If it had been conquered by a rival kingdom, it would be history. But Plato says it vanished with such force that even the landscape was changed. The sea where it had stood became shallow and muddy, blocked by debris left behind as the island sank. Now, that does not mean we should imagine an entire continent dropping cleanly into the Atlantic like a stone through water. Real geology is usually messier than legends. Islands can be shattered by earthquakes. Coastlines can collapse. Volcanic eruptions can trigger tsunamis. Underwater landslides can move enough water to destroy settlements far away. Sea level can rise and drown low-lying plains that once supported human communities. And when these things happen, the survivors do not need to understand plate tectonics to remember what they saw. They remember the ground shaking. They remember the sea pulling back. They remember a wall of water arriving where water had never reached before. They remember homes, temples, harbours, farms, and entire families disappearing in hours. That kind of memory can outlive the people who experienced it. It becomes a story told by descendants, then a sacred warning, then a legend. And after enough generations, the details may grow larger than life, because the emotional truth remains impossible to forget. Something powerful was here. Then the earth moved. Then the sea took it. There are real examples of disasters that show why this idea had such staying power. In 365 AD, a massive earthquake near Crete generated a tsunami that devastated coastlines across the eastern Mediterranean. Ancient writers described ships thrown inland and whole communities overwhelmed by water. In 1755, the Lisbon earthquake sent waves across the Atlantic and destroyed much of one of Europe's greatest cities in a matter of hours. And in 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami killed more than 200,000 people across multiple countries. Modern people had satellites, emergency systems, global communications, concrete buildings, and scientific institutions. Even then, the speed and force of the disaster were overwhelming. So imagine how a Bronze Age or Stone Age community would have understood it. No warning sirens, no seismic monitoring, no weather forecast. One moment, a coastal city is alive with fishing boats, markets, children, fires burning in homes. The next, the ground begins to convulse, walls crack. The harbour empties strangely, and then the ocean comes back roaring. For the people who escape, there is no distinction between natural disaster and the end of the world. That is one reason world reset stories appear again and again. A catastrophe does not have to destroy the entire planet to feel universal. It only has to erase the world people know, their roads, their food supply, their rulers, their religious places, their memory of what life was supposed to be. And there is another detail in Plato's account that makes the destruction even darker. Atlantis is not the only victim. The victorious Athenians vanish too. This is easy to overlook because Atlantis gets all the attention. But Plato's catastrophe does not simply punish the invading empire while sparing the virtuous defenders. The earth swallows the Athenian army. The sea takes Atlantis. The same event erases both sides of the war. That is not a neat moral ending. It is a reset. The aggressors are gone. The defenders are gone. The battlefield is gone. The island is gone. The people living afterward are left with no direct witnesses, no surviving state, and no obvious proof except a story supposedly preserved far away in Egypt. It is like history itself has been cut with a blade. Before the disaster, there is a world of kingdoms, armies, rival powers, and ambition. After the disaster, there are survivors trying to explain why the old world is missing. And if you're interested in the other mysteries where ancient stories seem to preserve memories of impossible disasters, you can get the book about 12 unexplained mysteries on the website, link in the description. But here is where we need to be especially careful. A story about a sudden flood does not automatically prove that Atlantis was a literal island empire. Humanity has lived beside dangerous water for tens of thousands of years. Floods, earthquakes, eruptions, and coastal collapses were not rare exceptions. They were recurring forces that shaped where people lived, what they feared, and what they passed down to their children. So Plato's one day and one night destruction could be read in more than one way. It could be the memory of a real catastrophe magnified through centuries of retelling. It could be a warning built from disasters Greeks already knew were possible. Or it could be something even more deliberate, a philosophical story designed to show that no amount of power can protect a society that loses its moral centre. And that brings us to the question that has divided readers since antiquity. Was Atlantis meant to be found beneath the water at all? Maybe not. Maybe Atlantis was never meant to be found on a map. Plato was not writing like a modern historian. He did not cite inscriptions, compare eyewitness accounts, or show his readers the Egyptian records he claimed Solon had heard about. He was a philosopher, and philosophers often use stories the way engineers use models. Not because every detail is literally real, but because the structure reveals something important. In this case, the structure is almost too perfect. Atlantis is rich, powerful, technologically impressive, and morally corrupted. Ancient Athens is poor by comparison, disciplined, united, and devoted to virtue. One represents a society ruled by appetite. The other represents a society ruled by reason. That is not a random contrast. It is the central concern of Plato's political philosophy. What makes a city strong? Wealth? Military power? Trade? Expansion? Or is the strongest society one whose people accept limits, control their desires, and put the common good above personal gain? Atlantis gives Plato a giant answer to that question. No empire, no matter how wealthy, can survive if it becomes arrogant enough to believe it deserves everything. And ancient Athens gives him the opposite answer. A society can be smaller, poorer, and still stronger if its people are united by justice. The problem is, Plato's ancient Athens does not look much like the Athens of actual history. It looks much more like Plato's ideal state from another dialogue, the Republic. Warriors live simply, society is organized around duty. Private greed is controlled. The city exists not to enrich its rulers, but to produce virtuous citizens. That should make us pause, because if Atlantis is the nightmare version of a corrupt city, then ancient Athens is the dream version of a perfect one. Plato may not be reporting lost history. He may be staging a philosophical experiment on the largest scale possible. What happens when the ideal city confronts the corrupt empire? For a moment, virtue wins, then nature itself wipes the board clean, and that ending may be more important than the location of the island. Plato lived in a Greek world that had seen cities rise, fight, fail, and disappear. Athens itself had once been an empire. It had demanded tribute from allies, built fleets, expanded its influence, and eventually suffered a catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Plato was born not long after that war began. He grew up in the shadow of Athenian decline. So when he describes a proud maritime power becoming aggressive, overreaching, and bringing destruction upon itself, he may be talking about Atlantis. But he may also be talking about Athens. That is what makes the story so unsettling. Atlantis is not simply some distant foreign enemy. It may be a mirror held up to Plato's own city, and to every powerful society convinced that its success makes it untouchable. Still, a philosophical purpose does not automatically mean there was no historical inspiration. Stories can be both. A writer can take real disasters, old traditions, half-remembered places, and political anxieties, then shape them into a warning. Shakespeare did it. Modern filmmakers do it. Ancient authors did it constantly. And that possibility has kept the search alive. The most famous theory places Atlantis at Santorini, the volcanic island in the Aegean Sea, once known as Thera. Around the 2nd millennium BC, Thera experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The explosion devastated the island, buried settlements in ash, and likely generated tsunamis across the eastern Mediterranean. Nearby, on Crete, the Minoan civilization was one of the great seafaring powers of the Bronze Age. It had palaces, trade networks, art, ships, and influence across the islands. For people living after its decline, memories of a wealthy sea empire damaged by earthquake, fire, and waves could have become the raw material for a legend. It is a compelling theory, but it has serious problems. The eruption of Thera happened roughly 1,600 years before Plato, not 9,000 years before Solon, as Plato's story claims. Thera was not an enormous island continent beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and the Minoans were not destroyed in one single day and night. Their decline was complex, unfolding across generations through natural disasters, political change, and possibly invasion. So Santorini may explain why Plato's story feels geologically believable. It does not neatly prove Atlantis. Another theory points west, toward the coast of southern Spain near the ancient site of Tartessos. This region was wealthy, connected to Atlantic trade, and vulnerable to flooding from rivers and the sea. Some researchers have suggested that an ancient coastal settlement could have been destroyed by a tsunami, perhaps linked to the same fault systems that produced the Lisbon earthquake. Others have looked to Sardinia, Malta, the Azores, the Canary Islands, the Caribbean, even Antarctica. That last one is especially popular in documentaries and internet speculation. The idea is that Atlantis lies beneath Antarctic ice, hidden since some ancient shift of the Earth's crust. But there is no credible geological evidence for a lost advanced civilization under Antarctica. The continent has been ice-covered for millions of years, long before humans existed. The Azores theory has a similar problem. They rise from the middle of the Atlantic, which seems promising if you imagine a sunken island. But geology does not support the idea that a giant continent-sized landmass recently dropped beneath the ocean there. Continents do not simply sink whole in a day. The Earth's crust does not work that way. What can happen is more local and in some ways more terrifying. Coasts flood, islands collapse, volcanic slopes slide into the sea, earthquakes trigger tsunamis, sea levels rise and swallow plains where people once hunted, farmed and built settlements. Northern Europe once had Doggerland, a vast lowland connecting Britain to the continent. After the last ice age, rising seas slowly drowned it. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive submarine landslide off Norway may have sent tsunamis across parts of the North Sea, devastating coastal communities. There is no evidence Doggerland was Atlantis, no rings of canals, no imperial capital, no lost army of millions. but it shows that entire human landscapes really can vanish beneath water. A place can be home for thousands of years, then become nothing but seabed, fishing ground, and rumour. Maybe that is why Atlantis refuses to die. Not because archaeologists are one dive away from finding a golden capital beneath the waves. Not because every mysterious rock formation is proof of a forgotten super-civilization. But because Plato gave a name to something humans have always feared. The knowledge that the world we build is not permanent. Cities feel solid. Harbours feel permanent. Empires feel inevitable when you're living inside them. But an earthquake, a flood, a war, a changing climate, or one generation of reckless decisions can make the familiar world disappear faster than anyone expects. Atlantis may be history. It may be allegory. It may be a disaster memory transformed into philosophy. The evidence does not let us say for certain. But perhaps that uncertainty is exactly why the story survived. Atlantis exists in the space between what the Earth can destroy and what human beings can imagine. A warning from a lost world, whether that world was real or not. And when we look at the next ancient tradition, the scale of the resets gets even bigger. Because in Hindu thought, worlds are not destroyed once. They are created, decline, collapse, and begin again. Number 3. Hinduism's cycles of Yugas. If Plato imagined one great civilization falling beneath the sea, Hindu cosmology imagines something even more radical. Not one lost age, not one flood, but a universe that moves through repeating eras, again and again, with human civilization rising, changing, fading, and returning on a scale so vast it makes ordinary history look almost microscopic. These ages are called Yugas, and according to many Hindu texts, we are not living in the first, best, or most stable age of the world. We are living near the end of a cycle. The basic pattern is built around 4 ages: Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. Think of them like 4 seasons of a civilization. Not identical seasons because each has its own character, but stages in a long cosmic process. A beginning, a gradual shift, a weakening, and an age of fracture. Then, according to the larger tradition, the sequence begins again. The first age is Satya Yuga, sometimes called Krita Yuga. Satya means truth. Krita means completed, accomplished, or perfect. This is the age imagined as the closest thing Hindu cosmology has to a golden age. In later descriptions, the world of Satya Yuga is orderly. Human beings are spiritually aware. Justice is strong. The distance between what people know is right and what they actually do is supposedly much smaller than it is now. It is important to understand what this means. These texts are not necessarily describing a literal prehistoric kingdom that archaeologists should be able to locate. They are describing a cosmic and moral framework, a way of thinking about time itself. In modern life, we usually imagine history as a line. The past is behind us, the future is ahead, progress, decline, invention, catastrophe, recovery, all moving forward along one road. The Yuga system sees time differently. Time is a wheel. A world can reach extraordinary heights, then lose what made it stable. Knowledge can survive in fragments. Institutions can fail. People can forget what their ancestors once understood. Then, after an immense interval, the conditions for renewal return. That is why these traditions feel so haunting when placed beside stories of Atlantis, ancient floods, and vanished cities. They suggest that collapse is not an interruption of history. It is part of the pattern. Satya Yuga is traditionally the longest of the 4 ages. In the most widely cited Puranic calculations, it lasts 4,800 divine years. But a divine year is not treated as an ordinary human year. In the traditional conversion, One divine year equals 360 human years, making Satya Yuga 1,728,000 human years. That number is staggering. It is far beyond the age of agriculture, far beyond the first cities, far beyond writing, pyramids, empires, and everything we normally call civilization. And that is the first warning against taking the system too casually. Some modern writers try to force these huge numbers into conventional archaeology. They look for a forgotten global civilization millions of years old, an advanced world before humanity was supposedly ready for one. But archaeology does not support that conclusion. We have no evidence of cities, metal industries, or technological societies existing on that kind of timescale. The Yugas belong first to religious cosmology, not to the archaeological record. But that does not make them meaningless. A myth does not need to be a newspaper report to preserve an idea that matters. It can be a map of fears, hopes, and patterns people believe they have seen in the world around them. And the pattern here is unmistakable. The age of truth does not last forever. After Satya Yuga comes Treta Yuga, the second age. Its traditional duration is 3,600 divine years, or 1,296,000 human years in the standard calculation. The name Treta is connected to the number 3. In some traditional explanations, righteousness or dharma is pictured as a bull standing on 4 legs during Satya Yuga. In Treta Yuga, 1 leg has been lost. The foundation is still strong, but it is no longer complete. That image is simple but powerful. A table with 4 legs feels solid. Remove one and it may still stand, but now it wobbles. Pressure matters. Balance matters. Small mistakes that once caused no trouble can suddenly bring everything down. Treta Yuga is associated in Hindu epic tradition with the era of the Ramayana, the great story of Rama. The exact relationship between epic narratives and cosmic chronology differs across texts and traditions, but Rama is commonly placed in this second age, and already the world feels more complicated. Order still exists. Great ideals still exist, but they must be defended. Conflict enters the picture. Kingship, duty, warfare, loyalty, exile, temptation, betrayal. The world is no longer effortlessly aligned with truth. People have to choose it. That is a major shift. In Satya Yuga, the ideal is said to be almost woven into the structure of existence. In Treta Yuga, it becomes something people can lose. Then comes Dvapara Yuga, the third age. Its traditional duration is 2,400 divine years, equal to 864,000 human years. Dvapara is linked to the number 2, and in the image of the bull, only 2 legs of Dharma remain. The world has not become empty of wisdom, far from it. Some of Hindu tradition's most important teachings are set in this era. But stability is now balanced on a knife edge. Dvapara Yuga is commonly associated with the Mahabharata, the enormous Sanskrit epic, centered on a dynastic struggle that erupts into the catastrophic Kurukshetra war. It is also the age of Krishna, whose teachings in the Bhagavad Gita have shaped Hindu philosophy for centuries. And if you want to get deeper into mysteries like these, including ancient traditions that may preserve memories of real disasters, you can get the book about 12 unexplained mysteries on our website. The link is in the description now. The Mahabharata is not a simple historical document. Its composition unfolded over centuries, and its events cannot be pinned to a single confirmed date in the way modern historians would want. But its place in the Yuga cycle matters because it presents a world under immense strain. Families divided against families, alliances collapsing, leaders trapped between duty and ambition, knowledge becoming powerful enough to destroy, but not powerful enough to guarantee wisdom. That is the Dvapara pattern. A civilization can still be brilliant while becoming unstable. It can produce great cities, great warriors, great thinkers, great wealth, and still move toward disaster. In fact, the Yuga cycle suggests that external greatness may be exactly what makes decline harder to recognize. Because when the buildings are tall, the armies are strong, and the old stories are still being told, nobody wants to believe that the foundations are weakening. And then comes the fourth age, the age Hindu tradition says we are living through now. Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga. The name can be misleading to anyone encountering it for the first time. Kali here is not the goddess Kali. It comes from an older word associated with strife, discord, misfortune, even the losing throw in a game of dice. And that tells you what this age is supposed to feel like. Not necessarily an age where every day is fire and darkness. Not an instant apocalypse. Something more familiar and maybe more unsettling. An age where the rules still exist but fewer people believe they apply to them. In the traditional image, Dharma, the moral order that held firm on 4 legs in the first age, now stands on only 1. Truth, compassion, self-control, duty, generosity, respect for learning, respect for elders, respect for the natural world, all of it becomes harder to maintain. Not impossible, harder. That distinction matters. Kali Yuga is not a story about goodness disappearing completely. If goodness vanished completely, there would be nobody left to recognize the decline. The tragedy is that people can still see what is right. They can still speak about it. They may even praise it publicly. But private ambition begins to win. The descriptions found in texts such as the Vishnu Purana, the Bhagavata Purana, and later Hindu commentaries are remarkably specific about the kind of decline they imagine. Wealth becomes the measure of status. Power replaces wisdom as the qualification for leadership. People are judged by appearance rather than character. Religious practice becomes performance. Learning becomes a tool for prestige, not understanding. Sound familiar? That does not prove these texts predicted the modern world. It would be too easy, and not historically responsible, to read every ancient warning as a prophecy of smartphones, stock markets, and political scandals. Human beings have complained about moral decline for a very long time. Ancient Romans did it, Greek poets did it, medieval writers did it. Every generation has a tendency to look backward and imagine that people used to be wiser, stronger, more honourable, more connected to something real. But the Hindu version goes further than nostalgia. It turns decline into a structural feature of time. According to this framework, societies do not simply decay because one ruler makes bad decisions, or because one enemy invades, or because people suddenly become worse than their grandparents. Decline happens because the age itself creates conditions that reward the wrong things. Think about that. If a society rewards patience, honesty, competence, and long-term responsibility, those qualities tend to spread. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but they have room to survive. Now reverse the incentives. Reward spectacle over substance. Reward wealth without asking how it was gained. Reward leaders for winning today even if they damage tomorrow. Reward people for appearing virtuous instead of acting virtuously when nobody is watching. You don't need demons. You don't need a curse. You get Kali Yuga. The Puranic descriptions often portray rulers who behave less like protectors and more like predators. Taxes become oppressive. Justice becomes something the wealthy can buy. Authority loses its sacred responsibility and becomes raw force. Families fracture under economic pressure. People move constantly, searching for security. Food becomes less reliable. The environment itself seems less generous. Again, this is not a clean archaeological record of one specific ancient collapse. It is a moral diagnosis written in cosmic language, but it is a diagnosis built from things real civilizations have experienced over and over again: corrupt governments, famine, war, debt, displacement. The feeling that institutions created to protect ordinary people have somehow turned against them. And perhaps the sharpest warning is hypocrisy. In Kali Yuga, the texts suggest people may still wear the symbols of virtue while abandoning its substance. A person can speak beautifully about truth while lying for advantage. A ruler can claim to defend order while creating chaos. A teacher can possess sacred words without possessing wisdom. It's like a library after a fire. The shelves may still be standing. Some books may still have titles visible on their spines. But open them and the pages are ash. The form remains. The meaning is gone. This is why Kali Yuga is not simply an age of ignorance. It can also be an age of information without understanding. An age where knowledge is everywhere, but wisdom is scarce. An age where people know more facts than ever and still cannot agree on what is real, what is valuable, or what kind of future they are building. For many believers, this is not just abstract philosophy. Traditional Hindu chronology places the beginning of Kali Yuga after the departure of Krishna, conventionally dated to 3102 BCE. By the standard Puranic calculation, the age lasts hundreds of thousands of years more. That number should make us cautious. It means the tradition is not offering a simple countdown to an imminent end. Claims that a particular modern date marks the final day of Kali Yuga usually come from later reinterpretations, alternative calculations, or modern speculation, not from the most widely cited traditional chronology. But there is another side to the idea, one that keeps Kali Yuga from becoming pure despair. If morality is hardest in this age, then even small acts of integrity carry greater weight. Choosing honesty when dishonesty is easy, choosing compassion when cruelty is rewarded, preserving knowledge when everyone else is distracted, these become acts of resistance, and that raises a much bigger question. If the world can reach a point where its moral foundations are almost gone, what does Hindu cosmology believe happens when the cycle can no longer continue? The answer is pralaya. The word is often translated as dissolution, but that can sound too simple, like somebody turning off a machine. Pralaya is not just destruction, it is the withdrawal of the world back into its source. In Hindu cosmology, creation is not a one-time event that happened at the beginning of history and will never happen again. The universe emerges, takes form, fills with life, passes through immense ages, and eventually dissolves. Then, after a period beyond ordinary human measurement, creation begins again. Not because the previous world failed in some final, permanent sense, because impermanence is built into reality itself. Think of a wave rising from the ocean. For a moment it has a shape, it has a crest, a direction, a visible identity. You can point at it and say, that is a wave. But the wave is never separate from the water. Eventually it falls, loses its form, and returns to the ocean. The ocean remains. Then another wave rises. That is closer to the idea of pralaya. The Puranic traditions describe several kinds of dissolution, and this is where the scale becomes almost impossible to grasp. There can be local destruction. A city can be destroyed. A kingdom can fall. A species can disappear. There are also vast dissolutions connected to the end of a cosmic day of Brahma, when the manifested worlds are withdrawn. And beyond even that is a final dissolution, imagined at the end of Brahma's unimaginably long life. These are not all the same event that matters because modern retellings sometimes flatten Hindu cosmology into a single story. The world ends, then starts over. The actual traditions are more layered. There are resets inside resets. endings inside larger endings. Civilizations perish while the world continues. Worlds dissolve while the deeper ground of being remains, and the agent of destruction is not always a flood. Sometimes it is fire, sometimes water, sometimes wind. Sometimes the simple exhaustion of an age that has run its course. In several Puranic accounts, when a cosmic cycle closes, drought consumes the earth. Rain stops, rivers shrink, vegetation dies, then powerful suns appear, scorching what remains. After fire comes a vast deluge. The boundaries between land, sea, and sky collapse into a single dark expanse of water. It is an image that appears again and again in ancient cultures, the world returning to water. But here water is not only a weapon, it is also a womb. The old form is erased so that new form can become possible. That is the strange emotional logic of pralaya. It is terrifying because everything familiar is lost. Mountains, cities, names, families, histories, achievements, all gone. But it is not nihilistic. The universe is not destroyed because existence has no meaning. It is dissolved because no particular form can last forever. Even the gods, in many Hindu traditions, exist within cycles larger than themselves. And this is where the idea becomes much more than a story about apocalypse. A linear view of history says the past is behind us, the present is where we stand, and the future is an open road leading somewhere new. Progress may happen, decline may happen, but time moves in one direction. The cyclical view says something different. What has happened before can happen again. Civilizations rise, believing they are permanent. They build monuments, laws, markets, armies, archives. They see themselves as the final achievement of history. Then conditions change. Climate shifts. Resources fail. Institutions lose legitimacy. Wars fracture trade networks. Knowledge becomes scattered. The people who survive may remember the world before only as legend. And after enough generations, legend becomes myth. The myth may preserve the emotional truth of a real disaster without preserving a date, a location, or a scientific explanation. That does not mean every cosmic story is secretly a literal historical record. There is no evidence that the Puranas are documenting one global flood or one vanished super-civilization. They are religious and philosophical texts, composed and developed across long periods by many communities. But their deeper observation remains hard to dismiss. Human beings keep building worlds that feel permanent, and human beings keep discovering that permanence was the illusion. If you've been following these stories and wondering whether they point to one buried historical event, or something even stranger, you can get the book about 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description. Now, there is another element of pralaya that makes it different from a simple disaster narrative. Something survives. In some traditions, Vishnu rests upon the cosmic ocean between cycles. In others, the seeds of future life remain latent, preserved through the dissolution. The universe is not empty in the ordinary sense. It is unmanifest. Potential is still there, waiting. This is why renewal is not portrayed as humans rebuilding from rubble in the modern survival story sense. It is more fundamental than that. The categories themselves are reset. A new order emerges. New beings appear. Time begins moving through its vast sequence again. And that can sound distant from ordinary life. Billions of years. Divine calendars, cosmic oceans, the end of worlds. But maybe that distance is the point. Hindu cosmology takes the human obsession with being the center of history and puts it in perspective. Our empires are not eternal. Our crises are not the first. Our age, however important it feels from inside, is one movement in something far larger. That does not make human choices meaningless. If anything, it makes them more urgent, because the cycle does not excuse decline. Kali Yuga may describe a world where virtue is difficult, but it does not tell people to surrender to corruption. Pralaya may promise renewal, but it does not give anyone permission to hasten destruction. The lesson is not, the world will reset, so nothing matters. The lesson is, nothing lasts, so what you do while it exists matters even more. And perhaps that is why these ancient cycles have endured. Not because they give us a timetable for the end of the world, not because they prove a forgotten civilization ruled the planet before us. They endure because they describe a pattern we recognize. Order becomes complacency. Complacency becomes decay. Decay reaches a breaking point. Something is lost. And from what remains, something new begins. The question is whether, when our own world changes beyond recognition, we will have preserved enough wisdom to recognize the beginning when it comes. Number 4. Zoroastrianism's deadly winter. If the Hindu stories imagine worlds ending through fire, flood, and cosmic dissolution, the ancient Iranian tradition gives us something colder. Much colder in the Vendidad, a Zoroastrian religious text preserved in the Avesta. The wise god Ahura Mazda speaks to a righteous king named Yima. And the message he delivers is not about an enemy army, a plague, or a moral decline inside a collapsing empire. It is a warning that winter is coming, not an ordinary winter. A winter so severe that life on the surface of the earth may not survive it. Now, the Vendidad is a difficult text. It was transmitted orally for centuries before being written down, and the surviving manuscripts are much later than the traditions they preserve. Scholars debate its dates, its layers, and how literally its strange passages should be read. This is not a simple eyewitness report from some lost age. But the story itself is unmistakable. A divine being warns humanity that the familiar world is about to become unlivable, and one man is chosen to preserve what can be saved. That man is Yima. In later Persian tradition, he becomes Jamshid, a legendary king associated with a golden age of abundance, order, and human prosperity. But in the Vendidad, Yima appears in a more ancient and mysterious role. He is not introduced as a prophet receiving commandments for the whole world. In fact, when Ahura Mazda first asks Yima to become the bearer of the religion, Yima refuses. It is a strange moment. The supreme god asks him to teach the sacred law, to guide humanity spiritually. Yima says no. Not because he is hostile, not because he rejects Ahura Mazda. He simply says that he is not suited to be the teacher and protector of the faith. So Ahura Mazda gives him a different task. If Yima will not become a religious messenger, then he will become a guardian of the living world. He is told to make the earth flourish, and according to the story, for a time he succeeds beyond anything ordinary humans could imagine. Under Yima's rule there is no death from cold or heat, no old age, no sickness, no envy, no violence. The earth is full. People and animals prosper. The world becomes so crowded with life that Yima must expand the earth itself, making room again and again for the growing population. It sounds almost like the opposite of an apocalypse. A civilization at its height, a world overflowing with abundance, a king who has somehow held disorder at bay. And that is exactly what makes the warning so unsettling. Because the disaster does not arrive after a long age of obvious decline. There is no crumbling empire, no invasion at the gates, no famine already spreading through the fields. The world is flourishing. Then Ahura Mazda calls Yima to a meeting. The location is described in mythic language, at a place where gods and humans can speak together. Ahura Mazda appears with the divine beings known as the Armasha Spentas, the beneficent immortals. Yima comes with the greatest of mortal men, and there, in the middle of this ordered and abundant world, Ahura Mazda tells him that terrible winters are going to fall upon the physical creation. The wording matters. This is not presented as a seasonal hardship that people can simply endure by gathering more firewood. It is a coming transformation of the world itself, the kind of event that makes normal life impossible. A disaster that threatens humans, animals, plants, the entire chain of life that Yima has spent his reign protecting. Imagine hearing that warning. You are the ruler of a land where life has multiplied so successfully that the earth has had to be expanded to contain it. You have known abundance for so long that scarcity may feel like an old story from another age. Then the creator of wisdom tells you that the surface world is about to turn against the living. No army can negotiate with a winter. No fortress can conquer the sky. No king, however powerful, can order the seasons to obey. That may be why the story feels so modern. We tend to imagine danger as something visible, an enemy, a weapon, a person making a choice. But climate catastrophe works differently. It can begin beyond the horizon in patterns too large for any one community to see. A shift in temperature, a failure of rain, a change in winds or ocean currents. At first, daily life continues. Then familiar systems begin breaking down. Crops fail, animals disappear. Routes become impassable. The rules that kept a society alive stop working. The Vendidad does not use modern climate language, obviously. It is a sacred text, not a scientific model. We should not force it into becoming a precise account of an ice age, a volcanic winter, or a specific prehistoric event. The evidence does not allow that kind of certainty. But it does preserve a very old human fear. What if the world that supports us is not stable? What if abundance is temporary? What if survival depends not on stopping the disaster, but on recognizing it early enough to prepare? Ahura Mazda's warning to Yima is not vague. He does not merely say that hard times will come. He gives Yima instructions, specific instructions. The kind that suggest preservation has to be deliberate. Not everyone can be saved. Not everything can be carried forward. Choices will have to be made about what belongs to the future. And that is where this story becomes even stranger. Because Ahura Mazda does not tell Yima to build a palace, raise an army, or escape alone into the mountains. He tells him to create something designed for survival, something enclosed, something separated from the dying world above. Yima is told to build a var. The word is usually translated as an enclosure, a refuge, or a fortified settlement. In later imagination, it often becomes an underground world, something like a vast bunker beneath the earth. But the original description is more complicated than that. The Vendidad does not give us a neat architectural blueprint. It gives us fragments, instructions, measurements, strange details that feel less like a mythic palace and more like a survival plan passed down in sacred language. Ahura Mazda tells Yima to make this var as long as a riding ground on every side. That sounds precise until you ask what a riding ground meant to the people who first told this story. Was it a compact enclosure? A large settlement? A space measured by the distance a horse could be ridden? In a particular ritual course? Scholars cannot turn that phrase into an exact modern map. But the important part is clear. This was not a cave for one king and his family. It was meant to hold a living community, and not just humans. Yima is instructed to bring into the var the seeds of the greatest, best, and finest beings on earth, the strongest people, the healthiest animals, the most useful plants, seeds from crops, seeds from fruit-bearing trees, pairs of animals, birds, dogs, red blazing fires, The language is selective, almost painfully so. Yima is not told to save every person, he is told to preserve representatives. A breeding population, a living archive, the beginnings of a future world compressed into one protected space. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you know the surface is about to become unlivable, food alone is not enough. You need seed grain for the next planting season. You need animals for milk, wool, labour, transport, and reproduction. You need people with skills, builders, farmers, herdsmen, midwives, tool makers, people who know which plants heal and which ones poison. People who can keep children alive long enough for the disaster to pass. You need memory. A refuge is not just walls and stored supplies. It is a machine for carrying knowledge across a break in history. And that may be the most haunting feature of Yima's Var. It is built on the assumption that the world outside can fail so completely that survival becomes a matter of preserving a small piece of life until conditions change. Not preserving wealth, not preserving monuments, not preserving a throne, preserving continuity. The Vendidad even describes the internal arrangement. The Var is to have dwellings, streets and watercourses. There are houses above, houses below, and a kind of central gathering place or marketplace. The exact translations vary because the Avestan language is ancient and difficult, and some terms have no perfect equivalent in English. But the image is unmistakable. This is not a cramped emergency shelter where frightened survivors wait in darkness. It is a settlement, a contained world, a place designed to function after the rest of the world has become hostile. And Yima is told to make a door with a window that shines from within. That detail is easy to miss, but it changes the feeling of the entire story. A door means the Var is sealed against something outside. A window means there is still light, still orientation, still some connection to the cycle of time beyond the enclosure. But what kind of light? The text says that in Yima's Var there are uncreated lights and created lights. Again, scholars disagree about exactly what this means. The uncreated lights may refer to the sun, moon, and stars. The created lights may be lamps, fires, or sacred illumination maintained by the inhabitants. Yet the passage becomes even stranger. It says the stars, moon, and sun are seen to rise and set only once a year, and that a year seems like a day. That is one reason the Var has fascinated people for so long. Is it underground? Is it hidden beneath a mountain? Is it a mythic realm outside ordinary time? Is it a symbolic image of ritual enclosure, where normal human experience is transformed? Or does the story preserve a distant cultural memory of people sheltering through prolonged darkness and cold? We have to be careful here. The text alone cannot prove any one answer. Ancient sacred stories are not simple field reports. They speak in layers, mixing physical survival, moral order, cosmic symbolism, and religious imagination. But whatever else the Var is, it is clearly designed to be self-contained. Water is brought inside, plants are grown inside, animals reproduce inside. Human beings form families inside. The text says that every 40 years a pair is born to every couple, human and animal alike. Whether that number should be taken literally, symbolically, or as part of a sacred ideal of controlled abundance is impossible to know. But it suggests a population meant to endure over generations. Not days, not one winter, generations. That is a different kind of survival story. Most disaster myths move quickly. The warning comes. The waters rise. The chosen survivors escape. Then the world begins again. Yima's Var feels slower, more deliberate. It imagines life continuing in isolation, protected from a ruined surface world with its own rhythms of birth, work, light, food, and time. The people inside are not merely waiting to be rescued. They are becoming the custodians of everything worth carrying forward. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Who gets chosen? The Vendidad is very specific that those brought into the Var should be physically sound, beautiful, and free from certain diseases or conditions. Modern readers can find this deeply troubling, and they should. It reflects an ancient worldview in which bodily wholeness, ritual purity, health, and cosmic order were tightly connected. It is not a humane modern evacuation plan. It is a sacred text from a distant society, making stark judgments about which lives represented an ideal future. That does not make the story less important. It makes it more revealing. Every survival plan contains choices. Every arc has a threshold. Every refuge forces someone to decide what is preserved, what is left outside, and what kind of world will be rebuilt afterward. And if you want to explore more mysteries where ancient stories, archaeology, and unanswered questions collide, you can get the book about 12 unexplained mysteries on our website. The link is in the description for Yima. The task is enormous. He must create an enclosed world capable of outlasting a world-ending crisis. But before we ask whether this strange Var was meant to be underground, symbolic, or something else entirely, we need to look more closely at the disaster it was built to survive. Because the disaster described in the Vendidad is not a flood, at least not at first. It begins with winter, a winter so severe that it does not sound like an ordinary bad season, or even a famine caused by a few failed harvests. The text speaks of evil winters falling upon the world. Snow is said to descend in thick flakes, even on the highest mountains. It accumulates so deeply that only a fraction of the animals can survive. Then comes the detail that makes the story feel almost like a disaster sequence. The snow melts, and when it melts, the land is flooded. So the world-ending event in Yima's story has two phases. First, deadly cold, then water everywhere. That combination is important. It means the Vendidad is not simply telling the same old flood story found in Mesopotamia and later traditions. Its destruction comes from a different direction. The threat is not rain falling from the sky until the earth disappears beneath the sea. It is a world locked under snow, livestock dying, plants buried, travel cut off, and whole communities isolated until the thaw turns frozen landscapes into rushing water. For people living on the Iranian plateau or in the mountain regions of Central Asia, that would not have sounded impossible. Winter was not an abstract enemy there. It was a force that could decide whether a village survived. A single severe cold season could kill herds. Snow could block mountain passes that connected one community to another. Late frosts could destroy crops before they matured. A sudden spring thaw could turn dry channels into violent floods. In a world without modern roads, stored fuel, weather forecasts, or emergency supply chains, a hard winter was not an inconvenience. It was a judgment passed by the sky. And that may be the most grounded way to understand the story. It could preserve cultural memory of real climate disasters. Not necessarily one single global event, not necessarily a literal winter that destroyed all life on Earth, but generations of people remembering what extreme cold did to fragile societies, then shaping those memories into sacred history. Imagine a herding community watching the snow arrive earlier every year. At first, it is manageable. Animals are brought closer to shelter. Grain stores are opened sooner than expected. Families wait for spring. Then spring does not come, or it comes too late. The grass does not return. The animals have nothing to eat. The weak die first. Then the young, then the people who depended on those animals for milk, wool, transport and food. And when the thaw finally arrives, it does not feel like rescue. Meltwater tears through valleys, destroys what little remains, and makes the ground too unstable to plant. That is exactly the kind of experience that becomes a story told for centuries. Not because every detail is a literal record, but because the fear behind it is real. Of course, some people have proposed much bigger explanations. The phrase deadly winter immediately makes modern minds think of the Ice Age. Could the Vendidad preserve a memory from the end of the last glacial period, when climates shifted rapidly and some regions experienced drastic environmental change? It is an intriguing idea. The end of the last Ice Age did involve enormous transformations. Ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, weather patterns changed, habitable regions shifted. Communities that had adapted to one landscape could find themselves facing another within only a few generations. And then there is the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to colder conditions beginning roughly 12,900 years ago. For more than 1,000 years, temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere dropped sharply after an earlier warming trend. The exact causes are still debated, though disruptions to ocean circulation are among the leading explanations. Whatever drove it, the Younger Dryas reminds us that climate can change hard and fast enough to alter the course of human societies. But there is a problem. The Vendidad was written down far later than the Younger Dryas. The surviving text belongs to a religious tradition that developed in historical times, even if some of its material may be much older. There is no direct evidence that a specific event from 12,000 years ago was preserved accurately in this story. That does not make the comparison useless. It just means we have to separate possibility from proof. The same caution applies to another popular theory, volcanic winter. A massive volcanic eruption can inject sulfur aerosols high into the atmosphere, reflecting sunlight and cooling the planet for years. Historical eruptions have caused crop failures, strange skies, failed monsoons, and famine across continents. The eruption of Tambora in 1815 led to the year without a summer in 1816. Snow fell in June in parts of North America. Harvests failed in Europe. Food prices soared. People starved. Now magnify that fear through an ancient imagination. A darkened sky, failed crops, snow at the wrong time, herds dying, floods after the thaw. It is easy to see why people connect Yma's winter to volcanic catastrophe. But again, easy is not the same as proven. No known eruption can be confidently matched to the Vendidad's narrative. The text gives us no date, no ash layer, no named mountain, no geological fingerprint. What it gives us is something more enduring, a pattern. The world becomes hostile. Ordinary life is no longer possible. Survival depends on preserving a small living core through a period of environmental collapse. Then, eventually, life continues. That pattern may be why Yma's story feels so modern. We live in a world that knows climate is not stable. We have seen droughts empty reservoirs, wildfires erase towns, floods overwhelm cities, and winters behave in ways people once considered impossible. We have satellite data, atmospheric models, and global communication. But beneath all that technology is the same ancient realization. Civilization is not permanent. It depends on weather remaining within certain limits. It depends on food systems continuing to work, on water arriving when it should, on roads staying open, on animals, crops, and people surviving one season long enough to reach the next. The Vendidad turns that realization into a sacred warning. Not a warning that the past can be reconstructed like a newspaper report, but a warning that worlds can narrow very quickly, that survival may depend on preparation, cooperation, memory, and the choice is made before the sky turns against you. And perhaps that is why the story ends not with total annihilation, but with continuity. The surface world may freeze, flood waters may come. The old order may fail, but life, carefully protected, can begin again. And thousands of miles from ancient Iran, another civilization would preserve its own startling vision of worlds created, destroyed, and reset according to a calendar written into the sky. Number 5. The Maya creation dates. If the Zoroastrian story imagines the world ending beneath snow and floodwater, the Maya gave time itself a scale so vast that human disaster began to look almost small. Not unimportant, not unreal, but small compared with the age of the cosmos. The ancient Maya are often remembered for their pyramids, their cities disappearing into jungle, their astronomy and their haunting carved monuments. But one of their most extraordinary achievements was something less visible. They built a way of counting time that could reach far beyond a human lifetime, beyond the history of a kingdom, beyond even the memory of an entire civilization. It was called the Long Count, and it was not just a calendar in the modern sense. It was a machine for placing events inside deep time. Most calendars repeat. A week repeats every 7 days. A year repeats every 12 months. Even the Maya had repeating calendars. They tracked a 260-day sacred cycle called the Tzolk'in, alongside a 365-day solar year called the Hab. Together, those cycles produced a calendar round, a combination that repeated roughly every 52 years. That was useful for marking ceremonies, planting seasons, political anniversaries, and the ordinary rhythm of life. But 52 years is not enough if you want to distinguish one event from another across centuries. What happens when two kings with the same name rule more than a century apart? What happens when a city wants to record the exact day a dynasty began, the exact date of a war, an alliance, an accession, or a ritual performed by a ruler who died long before anyone alive was born? You need a longer clock. The long count was that clock. It counted days forward in a nested system, almost like an odometer. The smallest major unit was the kin. One day, 20 kin made a uinal. 18 unals made a ton, a period of 360 days, close to a solar year. 20 tons made a katoon. 20 katoons made a baktoon. A baktoon contained 144,000 days. That is nearly 394 years. Now imagine a stone monument carved with a sequence like this: 9.12 11 5.18. To us it looks cryptic, a string of numbers separated by dots. But to a Maya scribe, each number marked a position in an enormous chain of time. Baktuns, ketuns, tons, unals, days. Put together they could identify a single day with astonishing precision. It was a historical timestamp. Not vague legend, not in the age of our ancestors, not long ago when the old king ruled. An exact location in time, and the Maya used it across the lowlands of what are now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras. Monuments recorded rulers coming to power. They recorded wars, captives, births, deaths, ceremonies, and dynastic turning points. The stone stelae of cities like Tikal, Copan, Palenque, and Quirigua were not just works of art. They were public records. They announced that a king's actions mattered not only in the present, but across the whole architecture of time. Think about the confidence required to do that. A ruler does not carve an exact date into stone unless he believes the future will care enough to read it. The long count was a declaration that history had structure, that the past could be ordered, that events did not simply vanish after the people who witnessed them died. They could be fixed in place. And this is where the Maya become especially important to a story about ancient world resets, because their inscriptions do not treat time as a short line moving from a beginning toward one final ending. Maya time could be cyclical, yes, seasons returned, ritual periods returned, important anniversaries returned, but their mathematics also allowed them to think in spans so huge that the present age was only one segment in a much larger sequence. They could count backward into unimaginable antiquity. They could count forward beyond their own era. Some Maya texts use units even larger than baktuns. There were pictons, calebtons, quintiltons, and alautons, each multiplying the scale again and again. The numbers become so large that they are almost impossible to picture. Not merely centuries, not merely millennia, millions of years. For comparison, many ancient societies preserved their past through genealogies. A king was the son of a king, who descended from another king, who descended from a founder, who descended from a god. The Maya did that too, but they also had something different. A numerical language for the abyss. They could write time with the kind of scale modern people associate with astronomy, geology, and cosmology. And that matters because it changes the way we should read their famous dates. The Maya were not necessarily obsessed with predicting one sudden final catastrophe. Their calendar system was built for duration, for recurrence, for dates that passed, transformed, and gave way to others. The turning of a great cycle could be enormously significant without meaning that existence itself had reached its last page. It is a little like watching the hands of a clock pass midnight. The date changes, one day ends, another begins. If you're standing at the center of a ritual world, that boundary may carry enormous spiritual weight. It may demand ceremony, remembrance, political display, maybe even fear. But the clock does not stop. It keeps moving. And before we go further, if these ancient mysteries are the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, you can get the book about 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description now. There is another reason the long count feels so strange to us. The Maya were not just counting time for practical administration. They were linking time to the sky. Their priests and astronomers watched Venus, tracked lunar cycles, calculated eclipses, and organized ritual life around celestial movements. They understood that the heavens were not random. Patterns repeated. Planets returned. The sun moved through its yearly path with a reliability that human rulers could only envy. So when they carved dates onto monuments, they were doing more than saying, "This happened on this day." They were saying, "This event happened at a meaningful point in the order of the universe." A king's accession could be connected to a calendar ending. A war could be framed by a celestial cycle. A ritual could be staged at a moment when past and present seemed to touch. And sometimes on those monuments, the Maya looked far beyond the reign of any king. They looked backward toward dates so ancient that even their own civilization stood near the edge of the timeline. That is exactly what we find at places like Palenque and Quiriguá. The Maya did not leave us one single creation story written in one single book. Their surviving record is scattered across stone monuments, temple stairways, painted ceramics, and the few codices that escaped destruction after the Spanish invasion. But the fragments that remain are enough to show something remarkable. Maya creation was not described as a vague time before time. It had dates at Quiriguá, in what is now Guatemala, a massive monument known as Stela C records, a date that Maya scholars recognize as the beginning of the current creation era. In long count notation, it is written as 13.0.0, a complete turning of 13 baktuns. The accompanying calendar round date was 4 Ajor 8 Kumku, using the correlation most scholars accept between Maya and modern calendars. That date falls in 3114 BCE. Now, that number can create the wrong impression if we are not careful. It does not mean Maya priests stood in 3114 BCE, watched the universe physically explode into existence, and wrote down what they saw. The inscription was carved more than 3,000 years later. It is a sacred statement, a placement of the present world within a cosmic order. But it is still astonishing. A civilization flourishing in the first millennium CE was deliberately anchoring its history to a creation date more than 3,000 years in its own past. And it was not merely saying that the world began. The text describes acts performed at that moment. The gods set things in order. At Quiriguá, the inscription refers to 3 stones being raised at a place called the First Three-Stone Place. One was associated with a deity scholars call the jaguar paddler, another with the stingray paddler. The third was connected to a supernatural being known as the Itsamnajaj, or sometimes a version of the maize and creator gods, depending on how scholars interpret the damaged and difficult text. The names can sound strange because we are hearing them through a gap of more than 1,000 years, filtered through broken glyphs and uncertain translations. But the basic pattern is clear. Before human kings erected monuments in their cities, divine beings had erected the first monuments in the cosmos. Think about what that means. A Maya king raising a stone stela in his capital was not simply building a public memorial. He may have been echoing the original act of creation. The monument in the city became a reflection of the first stones raised by the gods at the beginning of the present age. The king was not claiming to be a god in the simple sense. He was placing himself inside a sacred pattern. His accession, his ritual, his monument, his dynasty, all of it could be presented as an echo of something that happened at the dawn of cosmic time. This is why Maya inscriptions can feel so different from ordinary historical records. A modern plaque might say, "This building was opened on this date by this president." A Maya monument could say, in effect, "This ruler performed a ceremony on this date at a turning of the calendar, in imitation of the gods who established the world itself." History and myth were not sealed off from each other. They overlapped at Palenque, one of the great Maya cities of the classic period. This cosmic way of thinking becomes even more elaborate. The inscriptions inside the Temple of the Cross, the Temple of the Foliated Cross, and the Temple of the Sun trace the origins of a group of patron gods connected to the city. These are often called the Palenque Triad, G-I-E-I-I-E, and Gri. The labels are modern scholarly shorthand. The Maya had their own names for these divine figures, names that are still being studied and debated. But the inscriptions make a larger point unmistakable. The gods of Palenque had biographies. They were born on dates. And those dates reached backward into time on scales that make even the 3114 BCE creation date look recent. One of the gods is associated with a date more than 1,000,000 years before the present creation. Another is placed in an even more remote mythic past. These dates are not there because Maya scribes were confused about arithmetic. They knew exactly what they were writing. They were using their immense calendar system to place divine events outside the ordinary horizon of human memory. Imagine standing in a temple chamber while priests recited those inscriptions. Your king's reign might last 30 years. A dynasty might survive 2 centuries if it was lucky. Even a great city could rise and fall within a few generations. But the gods belong to a timeline measured in hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. That puts human power in a very specific position. Important, yes, sacred, possibly, but never permanent. And that may be one reason Maya rulers were so obsessed with anniversaries. They marked period endings. They performed rituals when calendar units turn. They erected monuments to connect their own brief moment of authority with cycles that had been moving since before the current world was ordered. It was a way of fighting mortality, not by denying that kings died. Maya inscriptions are brutally aware that kings died. They record deaths, burials, succession crises, defeated enemies, collapsing alliances. But they place those losses inside a larger structure, one where time continues to unfold according to sacred patterns. The most haunting part is that the Maya sometimes projected this same logic into the future. Not a vague future, not someday after we are gone. They wrote dates that had not happened yet, dates beyond the lives of the rulers commissioning the monuments, dates beyond the probable lifespan of the cities themselves. And one of those future dates would eventually become more famous than almost any other date in ancient history. That date was December 21, 2012. For years before it arrived, it was everywhere. Documentaries claimed the Maya had predicted the end of the world. Websites counted down the days, survival bunkers sold out. People stocked food, bought generators, moved into remote areas, and waited for earthquakes, solar flares, planet collisions, pole shifts, or some mysterious cosmic alignment that would wipe civilization away. Hollywood turned it into a disaster movie. TV specials treated it like a countdown to Judgment Day. And the strange part is, almost none of it came from the Maya. The fear centered on one simple fact. The long count date associated with the current creation era was 13.000. On the correlation used by most scholars, that cycle reached another 13.00 in December 2012. People looked at that number and assumed the calendar stopped. But it didn't. It rolled over. Think of an odometer in a car. When the number reaches 99,999 miles, the vehicle does not vanish in a fireball. The counter simply turns, and the car keeps moving down the road. Or think of New Year's Eve in 1999. There was genuine anxiety about Y2K because old computer systems might misread the date. But midnight did not mean time itself had ended. It meant one numbering system had reached a major threshold. For the Maya, 2012 was a period ending. An enormous one, absolutely. 13 Baktuns represented roughly 5,125 years. That is far larger than a human life, a dynasty, or even the entire history of most modern nations. It was worth marking. It was not a prophecy of annihilation. The surviving Maya record is not silent about destruction. Maya mythology includes dangerous gods, warfare, death, sacrifice, drought, and cosmic instability. The Popol Vuh, a Quiche Maya text written down after the Spanish conquest, but preserving older traditions, describes previous attempts at creating humanity that ended in failure. So it is understandable that modern readers looking for an apocalypse could find material that felt ominous. But understandable is not the same thing as correct. The specific claim that the Maya predicted the world would end in 2012 has no solid basis in Maya inscriptions. The text most often dragged into the story comes from Monument 6 at Tortuguero, a Maya site in southern Mexico. The monument is damaged. Parts of the final passage are missing, but it appears to mention the ending of the 13th Baktun and the descent or appearance of a deity called Bolon Yokte K'u. Bolon Yokte is a difficult figure. His name is often translated something like Nine Strides God, and he seems to be associated with transition, conflict, ritual, and the dangerous edges of cosmic order. That sounds dramatic. And it is dramatic. But a god appearing at a major calendar turning is not the same as the planet being destroyed. The inscription does not say oceans will rise. It does not say the sun will go dark. It does not say humanity will be judged, exterminated, or reset. It seems to describe a ritual event involving a deity at a major calendrical anniversary. That is exactly the kind of statement we should expect from a culture that treated time itself as sacred. And there is another problem for the apocalypse theory. The Maya wrote dates beyond 2012. At Palenque, inscriptions linked to the reign of the great King Kinich Janab Pakal project forward to an anniversary far beyond the 13th Baktun ending. One calculation points to a date in the year 4772 CE, associated with a future commemoration of Pakal's accession. Stop and think about that. A Maya inscription appears to imagine a ceremony, thousands of years after 2012. You do not schedule an anniversary in the far future if you believe the universe ends centuries earlier. This is the detail that should have ended the panic before it began. The Maya calendar was built to handle immense spans of time. A Baktun ending was a threshold, not a brick wall. Their numerical system could continue. Their cosmic chronology could continue. The count did not hit a final number and break. So why did the story become so powerful? Partly because apocalypse stories are irresistible. They turn a complicated ancient civilization into a simple warning. They give modern anxiety a date on the calendar. Economic instability, climate fear, war, disease, political division, all of it can be gathered into one terrifying idea. Maybe the ancients knew this was coming. But that is us speaking through the Maya, not the Maya speaking to us. There was also a commercial machine behind the fear. Books, television programs, internet forums, expensive retreats, emergency food kits, and dramatic documentaries all benefited from making uncertainty feel like evidence. A damaged inscription became a prediction. A calendar turning became a deadline. A sophisticated system of sacred mathematics became a doomsday clock. If you're interested in how these mysteries grow from real evidence into much bigger claims, you can get the book about 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description, and the real Maya story is more interesting than the fake one. They understood something modern culture often struggles to accept. Human beings live inside cycles we do not control. Rulers rise and die, cities expand and collapse, drought can devastate a kingdom, war can erase a dynasty, the world can feel finished for the people living through catastrophe. But time keeps moving. The Maya did not need to predict one final global apocalypse to recognize that worlds can end. A world can end when the rains fail. A world can end when enemies breach the city walls. A world can end when the king dies with no heir, when fields are abandoned, when monuments fall silent and the forest begins swallowing the roads. Their own civilization experienced versions of that. Many great cities of the southern lowlands declined during the 9th and 10th centuries. Population fell. Dynasties ended. Monument carving stopped in places where it had continued for centuries. For the people who remained, that must have felt like the end of an age. Yet Maya peoples did not disappear. Millions of Maya people live today across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Their languages are still spoken, their communities are still here. Their traditions survived conquest, epidemics, forced conversion, and political violence. That is the final irony of 2012. The world did not end because an ancient calendar reached a magnificent turning point. But the panic revealed something real about us. We still look at ancient ruins and wonder whether their builders saw disaster coming. We still search old texts for warnings about our own uncertain future. And when we find a date carved into stone, we want it to be a message meant specifically for us. Maybe the Maya message is not that everything ends on one assigned day. Maybe it is that every age believes it stands at the center of time, and every age eventually learns that time is much larger than itself. Number 6. Norse Ragnarök and the renewed earth. If the Maya gave us a calendar cycle that modern people turned into an apocalypse, the Norse gave us something far more direct, a prophecy of the end, Not the end of one kingdom, not the fall of one city, not a date on a stone monument. The end of the gods, the end of the human world, the end of the ordered cosmos itself, and then somehow a beginning after the ending. The story is called Ragnarök. Today the word gets used almost everywhere. Video games, comic books, movies, heavy metal albums, television series. It has become shorthand for giant wolves, burning skies, screaming warriors, and the final battle between gods and monsters. But the surviving Norse texts are stranger than the modern versions. They do not present Ragnarök as a heroic action scene with a clean victory at the end. They present it as something fated, something even the gods know is coming. A disaster written into the structure of reality long before anyone living can stop it. The most important source is a poem called Völuspá, usually translated as the Prophecy of the Seeress. It survives in manuscripts written down in Iceland in the 13th century, especially a famous collection called the Codex Regius. But the poem itself is generally thought to be older, shaped by an oral tradition that may reach back into the Viking Age and perhaps earlier. That distinction matters. We do not have a recording of some Viking standing beside a fire and reciting the original version. We have medieval manuscripts preserving poems that had probably been transmitted, altered, remembered, and performed across generations. So when we ask what the Norse believed, we have to be careful. Völuspá is evidence of a Norse mythic tradition. It is not a literal eyewitness account of prehistoric catastrophe. It does not prove that Scandinavians preserved a factual memory of a global flood or an actual world reset. But it does show that they imagined history as something larger and more dangerous than ordinary human time. Their world was not permanent. It had a beginning. It had an order, and one day it would break. The poem opens with an extraordinary demand for attention. A Völva, a female seer with ancient knowledge, calls on her listeners to be silent. She says she remembers the earliest time. She remembers the giants born long ago. She remembers a world before the world. This is not a casual storyteller opening with, "Once upon a time." This is a voice claiming knowledge from before the first sunrise, before fields, before halls, before kings, before human ancestors had names. Völuspá describes an original emptiness called Ginnunga Gap. No green earth, no sky overhead, no sun following its path. No settled order at all. Then the cosmos is shaped. The gods gather, the heavenly bodies find their places. The sun knows its course. The moon knows its course. The stars are assigned their positions. That detail is easy to miss, but it is central to the entire poem. For the Norse imagination, order is not automatic. The sun rising is not just a fact of nature. It is part of a cosmic arrangement. The sky works because it has been made to work. Time moves because its pieces have been set into place. And if that order was created, it can be unmade. The gods establish their world at a place called Idar Völ. They build halls, they make tools, they play games. They create structure out of the raw, unstable forces that existed before. Then come humans. In one part of the poem, 3 gods find 2 helpless beings on the shore, without strength, without fate, without the qualities that make a human life possible. The gods give them breath, awareness, warmth, and appearance. They become Ask and Embla, often treated as the first man and woman. Again, the point is not that this resembles a scientific account of human origins. It clearly does not. The point is that humans occupy a fragile place inside an ordered world made by powers greater than themselves. We are not outside the cosmic drama, watching it safely from the audience. We are inside it, dependent on forces we cannot command. And the gods are not fully safe either. That is one of the most unsettling things about Norse mythology. In many religious traditions, divine beings stand above time. They are eternal, invincible, beyond decay, but the Norse gods know that they have enemies. They know that boundaries are under pressure. They know that the future contains events even Odin, the chief god, cannot simply erase. Odin spends much of Norse myth pursuing knowledge. He gives up an eye for wisdom at Mimir's well. He hangs on the world tree, wounded by his own spear, seeking the secrets of runes. He questions the dead. He seeks out seers. He tries to understand what lies ahead. Why would the greatest god need to know the future so desperately? Because knowing is not the same as controlling. That is the cold logic behind Ragnarök. The future has been spoken. The warning signs exist. The gods prepare, but preparation does not guarantee escape. The word Ragnarök is often translated as the fate of the gods or the doom of the gods. A later variation, Ragnarökr, means something closer to Twilight of the Gods, which sounds more poetic and became famous in modern culture. But the older meaning is harsher, not twilight. Doom, a final appointed reckoning, and Völuspá does not tell this story from the comfortable distance of someone who assumes everything will work out. The seeress speaks as though she can already see the coming collapse. She sees the moral order fraying, oaths breaking, kin turning against kin, the old protections of society failing from within. That is where Ragnarök truly begins, not with a monster appearing from the dark, not with a single explosion in the sky. It begins when the world's deepest bonds start to come apart. When oaths mean nothing, violence becomes easier. When families turn against each other, nobody can count on protection from the people closest to them. Völuspá describes a world entering what it calls the Fimbul winter. A terrible winter, then another after that. 3 winters in a row with no summer between them. No growing season to restore the fields, no warmth to break the ice. No reliable cycle of renewal. For people living in Northern Europe, this was not an abstract fear. Winter could already be deadly. A failed harvest could mean hunger by spring. Ice could cut off travel and trade. Livestock could die. Stored grain could run out. A few bad years in succession could turn a settled community into desperate refugees. So imagine 3 years of winter without relief. The poem does not give us a weather report. It is myth, not climate data. Still, the image lands with unusual force because long winters were a real threat in the Norse world. The end does not begin with some impossible event from another universe. It begins with the failure of the seasons people depend on. And then the sky itself begins to fail. The wolves that have pursued the sun and moon finally catch them. The sun is swallowed. The moon disappears. Stars vanish from the heavens. Again, this is not meant as astronomy. The Norse were not predicting that literal wolves would eat celestial bodies. But think about what those images mean. The sun has been following its appointed path since the world was made. The moon has kept time. The stars have marked the night. These were signs that the cosmos was still functioning. Now the lights go out. The careful order established at the beginning of the world is being reversed, piece by piece. The earth shakes, mountains tremble, trees are torn loose. The great world tree, Yggdrasil, shudders even though it holds the worlds together. And beneath the ground, beneath the sea, the things that had been bound begin to break free. The wolf Fenrir, held in chains because the gods knew what he would become, snaps his restraints. The Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, so enormous that it circles the human world in the ocean, rises from the water. It twists across the land and sea, sending waves crashing over the earth and spraying poison into the air. The ship Naglfar is launched. In Norse tradition, it is made from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, which is exactly the kind of detail that tells you this myth was not designed to make anyone comfortable. Even death contributes material to the final disaster. The ship carries enemies of the gods toward the battlefield called Vigrid, a vast plain where the last conflict will take place. Giants advance, monsters advance, the dead advance. Loki, who has been bound for his role in the death of Balder, breaks free and joins the forces attacking the gods. Everything contained, restrained, buried or exiled is coming back. And at the head of this destruction comes Surtur. Surtur is a fire giant associated with Muspelheim, the realm of heat and flame. In the Norse creation story, fire was one of the primordial forces that existed before the ordered world. It helped create life when it met the ice and emptiness of Ginnungagap. At Ragnarök, fire returns in a different form, not as creation, as destruction. Surtur advances carrying a blazing sword, or in some translations a weapon shining brighter than the sun. Fire spreads across the world. The sky burns. The earth is consumed. This is one reason Ragnarök is so striking compared with the simple idea of a flood destroying everything. It is not one disaster. It is winter, darkness, earthquake, poison, war, fire, and finally water. It is as if every force that makes the world dangerous has been released at once. And in the middle of it stand the gods, not watching from a safe place, fighting. Odin goes to face Fenrir. This is the chief god, the seeker of wisdom, the ruler who spent his existence gathering knowledge about the doom he could not avoid. And Fenrir swallows him. That is one of the central shocks of Ragnarök. Odin dies. The god who gave up an eye for knowledge, who learned secrets from the dead, who tried to prepare for the future, is still taken by the wolf. His son Vidar avenges him, killing Fenrir, but the victory changes nothing. The battle is already beyond saving. Thor confronts Jörmungandr, his oldest enemy. He kills the serpent, but Jörmungandra's venom is everywhere. Thor walks only 9 steps before he falls dead. Tyr fights the monstrous hound Garma. They kill each other. Heimdall, guardian of the gods, meets Loki. They kill each other too, and Freyr, the god associated with fertility, peace and prosperity, faces Surtur. But Freyr once gave away his magical sword. At the end, he must fight without it. Surtur kills him. There is no clean triumph here, no moment when the forces of order rally and push chaos back into its cage. The gods can destroy monsters. They can avenge one another. They can fight with unimaginable courage. But courage is not the same as survival. That may be the bleakest idea in the whole poem. Even divine power has limits. Even the beings who shaped the world cannot guarantee that it will last. The final battle is not a rescue operation. It is the collapse of the old cosmic order in full view of everyone who once believed it was permanent. Then Surtur's fire sweeps across the world, the land burns, the sky darkens, and after fire has done its work, the earth sinks beneath the sea. That image is worth pausing over, not merely a city flooded, not merely one coast swallowed by a storm surge. The earth itself disappears under water. For a moment, the world seems to return to the condition before creation. No familiar land, no stable human home, no visible order, just the sea closing over everything that came before. And yet Völuspá does not end in that darkness. Instead, the sea gives the earth back. Völuspá says the world rises again, green and beautiful from the waves. Fields grow without being planted. Eagles fly above waterfalls, hunting fish in clear rivers. The old poison is gone. The old fire is gone. The shattered world is alive again. And that alone would make Ragnarök unusual. Most apocalypse stories end with destruction. The wicked are punished. The world is judged. The survivors, if there are any, live among ruins. But the Norse story imagines something more radical. The old world does not simply get repaired. It is replaced. A new earth rises where the old one sank. Not necessarily perfect, not necessarily free from all danger, but renewed, cleansed of the forces that had driven the old order toward collapse. And then we learn that humanity has not completely vanished. 2 humans survive. Their names are Lif and Lifthrasir. The names are usually translated as Life and Life Yearner, or Life and the one who strives for life. Even their names tell you what role they play in the story. They are not warriors who defeat the monsters. They are not kings who rebuild an empire. They are not gods who command the elements. They are simply the people who remain. According to the poem Vafthrûnismál, Lif and Lifthrasir hide in a place called Hodmi-Misholt during the destruction. The name is difficult to translate exactly, but it is often understood as Mimir's wood, or the treasure wood of Mimir. Mimir is associated with wisdom, memory, and hidden knowledge. In another Norse story, Odin gives up one of his eyes to drink from Mimir's well, gaining wisdom at a terrible price. So the survivors do not hide in just any forest. They hide in a place connected with ancient memory. And what do they eat while the world burns and sinks around them? Morning dew. That detail is almost painfully simple. No enormous ark packed with supplies. No magical fortress above the clouds. No army guarding the final refuge. Just 2 human beings concealed in the woods, living on dew. It is the smallest possible image of survival. The world has been destroyed by winter, darkness, monsters, fire, and flood. The gods themselves have fallen, yet somewhere hidden beyond the battlefield and beyond the burning land, 2 people endure. Not because they are stronger than Ragnarök, because they are small enough, distant enough, and perhaps lucky enough to outlast it. When the new earth rises, Lif and Lifthrasir emerge, and they have children. Their descendants repopulate the world. Think about the scale of that idea. Everything familiar is gone. The great hall of the gods is gone. The old enemies are gone. The old political order, the old families, the old feuds, the old promises, all swept away. Humanity begins again from 2 survivors. That does not mean the Norse myth should be read as a literal record of a real population bottleneck. There is no archaeological evidence that all humans were ever reduced to one Norse couple hiding in a sacred forest. This is mythic language, but mythic language often preserves the fears that mattered most to the people telling it. For the Norse, survival was never guaranteed by wealth or power. A chieftain could lose everything in one bad season. A farm could be buried by ash. A ship could vanish in a storm. A family line could end with a disease outbreak, a feud, or a failed harvest. Lif and Lifthrasir embody the hope that even after catastrophe strips away everything people thought was permanent, life can continue. Not unchanged, but continued, and notice what survives alongside them. Several gods return after the destruction. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, remain. Mothi and Magni, sons of Thor, survive and inherit their father's hammer, Mjolnir. Baldur returns too. Baldur had been killed long before Ragnarök, through Loki's betrayal. His death was one of the first signs that the old world was already breaking apart. But after the fire and flood, Baldur comes back from the realm of the dead. So does his brother Hörð, the blind god who killed him. In the old world, their story was tragedy. One brother dead, another manipulated into causing it, revenge and grief spreading through the gods. In the new world, they return together. That may be the deepest renewal in the entire myth. Not just land restored, not just food returning to the fields. A wound in the moral order is healed. The surviving gods gather on the plain of Idavul, where the gods once met before catastrophe. They talk about the past. They remember the old events. They find the golden game pieces that belonged to the gods before the world fell. It is a strangely quiet scene after all that violence. No battle cries, no collapsing mountains, no flames across the sky. Just survivors sitting together, remembering. Maybe that is what renewal actually requires. Not forgetting the disaster, remembering it well enough not to build the exact same world again. There is even a new sun. Before the old sun was swallowed, she gave birth to a daughter who takes her place in the sky after Ragnarok. Again, the pattern is clear. The old light disappears. But light itself does not die. It continues through a new generation. And that is why Ragnarok is not quite the Norse version of the end of everything. It is an ending, absolutely, a brutal one, but it is also a reset. The cosmos passes through destruction and comes out transformed on the other side. If you want to go deeper into stories like this, including 12 unexplained mysteries from ancient history and the modern world, you can get the book on the website. The link is in the description now. It is important not to force Ragnarok into a modern disaster theory. Some people see the long winter and imagine volcanic eruptions. Others see the sinking earth and imagine memories of floods or rising seas. Those comparisons can be interesting, especially because Northern Europe really did experience climate shocks, storms, famine, and environmental change. But the poems themselves are doing something larger than recording one event. They are asking what remains when every source of security fails. When the sun is gone, when the land is gone, when even the gods cannot save the old order. Their answer is unexpected. A hidden pair survives. A child of the sun carries light forward. The dead return. The earth rises green from the sea, and life begins again. Number 7. Hopi traditions of earlier worlds. The Norse imagined a world that sinks beneath the sea and rises again. Hopi teachings describe something even more expansive. Not one world ending, several. In many accounts shared by Hopi elders and writers, human beings are living in what is called the fourth world. The world we know is not the first creation. It is not even the second or third attempt. It is the latest world in a sequence of worlds, each one ending, when the people living there could no longer continue as they had before. That idea can sound almost modern, like humanity has been through resets before. Like civilization, or perhaps the whole human order, has collapsed repeatedly and been rebuilt by survivors. But the Hopi story is not presented as archaeology. It is not a buried historical chronicle waiting to be decoded with satellites and excavation tools. It is sacred tradition carried through oral teaching, ceremony, place, and community memory. And like many oral traditions, it does not exist as one single identical version. Different Hopi villages, families, and spiritual leaders have preserved different details. Names may be translated differently. The order and meaning of events can be explained in different ways. Some accounts were shared publicly in the 20th century. Others remain private, ceremonial, or not meant for outsiders at all. Still, a broad pattern appears again and again. There were earlier worlds. They ended, and life continued into another one. In one widely known version, the story begins with Taiwa, often described as the creator. Before there were people, before there was land, before there was a sun moving across the sky, Taiwa brings into being a helper called Sotuknang. Sotuknang is given the task of arranging the worlds. And then comes another figure whose presence runs through many versions of the story, Spider-Woman. Sometimes she is described as a grandmotherly creator figure. Sometimes as a guide, sometimes as the one who helps shape the first people and gives them life. The names matter, but the structure matters too. Humanity does not appear in a finished, permanent world. Humanity appears inside a process. A world is made. People enter it, something goes wrong. The world ends. Another begins. The first world is often called Tokpela, a name commonly translated as endless space. Picture that for a moment. Not a planet already crowded with cities, roads, and borders. Not an old world carrying the weight of thousands of years of history. A first world, a beginning place. In accounts recorded from Hopi tradition, the first people were not yet exactly like people today. They lived in a world lit differently from our own, under the care of the beings who had brought them into existence. It was a time of possibility, but possibility has a shadow. The first world does not last. In one commonly retold account, its destruction comes through fire. The earth burns. Volcanoes erupt. Fire comes from above and below. The first world is consumed. That sounds familiar. Across this entire list, destruction keeps arriving in a handful of forms. Flood, ice, darkness, fire, a sky turned hostile, an earth that no longer gives life. The details change from culture to culture. The meaning changes too. But fire is one of humanity's oldest fears, because it can be both giver and taker of life. It cooks food, it brings warmth, it protects the camp at night. And then, under the wrong conditions, it takes everything. A forest fire does not care who built the village beneath it. A volcanic eruption does not recognize a boundary stone. Fire is one of the few forces that can make a familiar landscape unrecognizable in hours. For people living in the volcanic southwest, that was not an abstract idea. The Hopi mesas rise in a region shaped by deep time, wind, stone, drought, and ancient volcanic landscapes. The land itself carries evidence that the earth has never been still. But again, it would be too simple to say the First World story is just a memory of one eruption. Myths are not newspaper reports. They take the disasters people know and place them inside a larger question. What kind of world can endure? After the First World ends, the people are not simply gone. They are brought into another world, the Second World. This one is often called Tokpa, sometimes translated as Dark Midnight. Even the name changes the feeling. Endless space suggests openness, beginning, a vast horizon. Dark midnight suggests uncertainty, a time when direction is hard to see, a time when people may not know what lies beyond the next step. And this second world also comes to an end. In a number of public tellings, it is destroyed by cold. The world freezes. Ice covers the land. The people who survive are guided onward, leaving behind a world that has become impossible to inhabit. Now think about the pairing. First fire, then ice. Two opposite forms of destruction. One world is overwhelmed by heat, another by cold. One burns, another hardens. To ancient people, those may have seemed like total opposites. Yet both can do the same thing. Both can cut off food. Both can destroy shelter. Both can turn a living landscape into a place where human life cannot continue. And that is one reason these traditions feel so unsettling now. We tend to think of history as a straight line, ancient people, then cities, then empires, then us. More knowledge, more machines, more control. But the story of earlier worlds suggests another possibility. What if progress is not a straight road? What if it is a series of chances? A world can be given to a people. It can flourish for a time, and then something fundamental can break, not necessarily because the planet itself has vanished, but because the conditions that made life possible have changed beyond recognition. After the Second World, the survivors enter a third. This is often called Kuskurza, and in the traditions surrounding it, the scale of the story grows larger still, because the Third World is not remembered as a place of simple beginnings. It becomes a world of great development, powerful knowledge and extraordinary human achievement, and that is where the story starts to become truly dangerous. Because in many public versions of the tradition, the problem was not that the people of the Third World lacked knowledge. It was that they had knowledge without balance. They became ambitious. They became divided. They forgot the responsibilities that came with the gifts they had been given. Some retellings describe people travelling through the air, using powerful devices, building great settlements, and reaching far beyond the limits that had once guided them. These details have attracted endless speculation. People see flying machines and immediately ask whether the Hopi were describing lost technology. Others see distant lands connected by strange vehicles and start looking for Atlantis, aliens, or evidence of a forgotten global civilization. But that misses the deeper warning. The point is not necessarily that an ancient people invented airplanes. The point is what happens when ability grows faster than wisdom. A society can become extraordinarily capable and still become fragile. In fact, greater power can make the consequences of imbalance even worse. If a small community makes a bad decision, it may damage one valley. If a vast and interconnected society makes a bad decision, it can damage the conditions of life across an entire world. That is the danger sitting inside these stories. Not ignorance, not weakness, power without responsibility. And for the Hopi, responsibility is not only about individual behavior, it is about relationship. Relationship between people, relationship with the land, relationship with animals, water, ancestors, and the spiritual order that makes life possible in the first place. This is where the word balance becomes important. Balance does not mean standing perfectly still. It does not mean refusing change. The Hopi have survived centuries of change, pressure, migration, drought, colonial violence, and upheaval. A balanced life is not a frozen life. It means knowing that every action reaches beyond the person who performs it. Take water in the high desert. Water is never just water. It is rain that may not come. It is a spring that can fail. It is a cornfield surviving one more season. It is the difference between a village enduring and a village leaving. In a place where drought can stretch across years, people do not need a scientific model to understand dependence. They live it. You can call that ecology. You can call it survival. In Hopi spiritual life, it is also obligation. Ceremony, in this understanding, is not separate from the practical world. It is part of maintaining a right relationship with it. Farming, prayer, community duty, restraint, and remembrance are tied together. The human community is not imagined as standing above nature, issuing commands to a silent landscape. It is one participant inside a much larger order, and when that order is ignored, the consequences are not merely private. They spread. That is why migration stands at the centre of so many Hopi accounts. The people do not simply arrive at the mesas and decide to settle there because the view is good. Their presence is connected to long journeys, guided movements, clan histories, and responsibilities carried from place to place. Different clans followed different routes. They travelled, stopped, encountered other communities, sometimes separated, sometimes joined together. Over generations, these journeys formed a map that was not drawn only on paper. It was drawn into memory. A spring could mark a stopping place. A distinctive rock formation could preserve a story. A ruined settlement could hold the memory of people who passed through generations before. A trail across dry country could be more than a path between 2 points. It could be evidence of a promise. This is one of the most remarkable features of migration traditions. For modern people, migration often sounds temporary. A disruption, a crisis, something that happens when the real home has been lost. But in these traditions, movement can be part of becoming who you are. The journey teaches people how to live together. It reveals whether they can share resources. It tests whether they remember the instructions they were given. It forces them to decide what they will carry forward and what they will leave behind. Imagine moving across the southwest without modern roads, without weather forecasts, without a supermarket waiting at the next town. Every choice matters. Where do you find water? Which seeds can survive here? Who knows the route? Which group has kin ahead? What happens when the rains fail? How do you keep children, elders, stories and ceremonial obligations alive while the landscape keeps changing beneath your feet? Migration is not just movement across geography. It is the preservation of a world across time. And that makes the Hopi tradition very different from the fantasy version people sometimes want to impose on it. There is no simple tale of a mighty lost empire wiped out overnight, leaving behind a secret machine for future archaeologists to discover. The survivors carry something more durable than a machine. They carry instructions. They carry memory. They carry a way of measuring whether human life is still in balance. That may sound less dramatic than sunken cities and impossible technology. But it is actually more challenging. A machine can be rediscovered. A moral responsibility has to be practiced again and again by every generation. If you want to go deeper into mysteries where history, legend, and unanswered evidence collide, the book about 12 Unexplained Mysteries is available on the website. The link is in the description. Now, the Hopi migration accounts are rooted in specific places, but they also describe something universal. Every society tells itself that it has arrived. We build houses. We name streets. We mark borders. We create institutions so solid that they begin to feel permanent. After a few generations, it becomes easy to forget that our ancestors were once travellers too, that they crossed dangerous ground, depended on strangers, and survived only because somebody remembered where the water was. The Hopi story resists that forgetting. It says arrival is never the end of responsibility. You can reach a place promised to your people and still lose it if you live wrongly there. You can inherit a world and still fail the obligations that allow it to remain habitable. And there is another element in the migration traditions that makes the warning even sharper. The people were not all meant to take the same path. Some clans moved in one direction, others moved somewhere else. Some carried responsibilities that belonged to their own people, their own ceremonies, their own place in the larger whole. The goal was not to make every community identical. It was to preserve difference without losing connection. And that brings us to the most important thing an outsider has to understand about Hopi traditions. They are not ours to decode like a puzzle box. For more than a century, visitors, scholars, writers, spiritual seekers, and conspiracy theorists have approached Hopi teachings with the same question. What secret history is hidden inside them? They want dates, they want maps, they want proof of vanished continents, ancient machines, global floods, underground cities, alien visitors, and exact predictions of the end of the modern world. Sometimes they find a fragment of a story, remove it from its ceremonial and cultural setting, and build an entire theory around it. But that is not understanding. That is extraction. Hopi traditions are living traditions. They belong to living communities. They are carried by families, clans, ceremonial societies, elders and people whose relationship to the land did not end when an anthropologist wrote something down or when a popular author turned it into a paperback mystery. And not every teaching is meant for every audience. That can be difficult for modern audiences to accept. We have been trained to think information wants to be free, that every story should be published, catalogued, translated, and made available to anyone with an internet connection. But knowledge has responsibilities. A ceremony can be public, private, or restricted. A story can have layers that are shared differently depending on who is listening, where it is being told, and what obligations that listener carries. Some details may be preserved within particular clans. Some are not meant to be recorded. Some may be told in one form to children, another in a ceremonial context, and another not at all outside the community. That does not make the tradition less real. It makes it more human. Think about your own family. There are probably stories everyone knows. The funny story told at holidays. The story about how your grandparents met. Then there are other stories that stay inside the family. Stories connected to grief, conflict, sacrifice, or things that cannot be explained to strangers in a few sentences. Now imagine that family has been preserving its identity for centuries under pressure from colonization, forced schooling, land loss, missionary campaigns, tourism, and outsiders who repeatedly treated sacred things as souvenirs. You might be careful too. This is why there is no single, final, universally authorized Hopi prophecy that can be lifted from a website and treated as a timetable for the apocalypse. There are public accounts. There are accounts recorded by ethnographers. There are teachings shared by individual Hopi speakers. There are interpretations that have travelled far beyond Hopi lands and become famous around the world. But they are not all equal, and they do not all speak for every Hopi person, every village, or every clan. The Hopi are not a museum exhibit frozen in some imagined ancient past. They are a people with communities, disagreements, religious responsibilities, political concerns, and the same right as anyone else to decide how their traditions are represented. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud, yet look at what happens online. A dramatic quotation appears beside an image of a desert mesa. It claims the Hopi predicted skyscrapers, railroads, world wars, a blue star, a red star, a great purification, or the exact collapse of industrial civilization. It gets shared thousands of times. Then someone adds a line that was never in the source. Someone else turns a symbolic image into a literal forecast. By the end, a living indigenous tradition has been transformed into a doomsday meme. The story becomes popular precisely because it is no longer being treated with care. And this matters for our larger question. Are these traditions evidence that ancient people remembered actual world-ending catastrophes? Sometimes there may be historical memory inside a tradition. Oral histories can preserve remarkable information across generations. Stories of floods, droughts, migrations, eruptions, famines, and changes in the landscape may contain memories of real experiences. Archaeology can sometimes illuminate the world in which those memories were shaped. Tree rings can reveal long droughts. Settlement patterns can show movement and abandonment. Ancient pollen can reveal changing climates. Ruins can show that communities adapted, relocated, merged, or disappeared. But archaeology cannot simply open a door and announce that it has proven every sacred teaching. A ruin can tell us where people lived. It can show what they built, what they ate, what materials they traded, and sometimes when a settlement changed. It cannot by itself tell us the full spiritual meaning a community gives to that place. That meaning belongs to the people who carry the tradition. And the reverse is true as well. A sacred account does not need to function as a modern scientific report in order to matter. It can preserve ethical truth, cultural memory, and a way of understanding human responsibility that no carbon date can measure. We make a mistake when we force every ancient story into only two boxes. Either it is literal history, every detail verified, or it is fantasy, nothing but imagination. Human traditions are more complicated than that. A story can speak about a migration and teach people how to behave during hardship. It can connect a real landscape to a sacred obligation. It can describe earlier worlds not as planets in a scientific sequence, but as moral conditions, ways of life, stages of relationship between people and the order around them. That does not make it vague, it makes it deep, because maybe the question is not whether we can locate the exact ruins of a previous world beneath the desert. Maybe the question is why so many people in so many places understood that a world can end before the earth does. A world ends when its relationships break down, when people no longer know what they owe one another, when they treat land as if it has no limits, when power becomes more important than restraint. When memory is replaced by appetite, that is not a prediction from another civilization. It is an observation available to every civilization. The Hopi teachings should not be used as evidence for somebody else's fantasy about lost super-civilizations. They ask for something harder than belief in a hidden past. They ask for humility. They ask us to recognize that we are not the first people to believe our world is permanent, not the first people to confuse technical ability with wisdom, not the first people to stand at a moment of uncertainty and wonder whether we have crossed some line we cannot easily cross back over. And maybe that is why the stories of earlier worlds remain so powerful. They do not offer us a comfortable promise that survivors will always be chosen, or that renewal will happen automatically after destruction. They place the responsibility closer than that. The next world is not waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. It is being shaped by what people do in this one, and that is the thread running through all 7 of these traditions. Not one single story, not one single disaster, not proof that a forgotten global super-civilization was wiped from the map again and again. Something more interesting than that. A pattern. In Mesopotamia, flood stories survived for centuries before Gilgamesh, shaped by a land where rivers could create life and destroy it in the same season. The flood was not simply water, it was a confrontation with human vulnerability, divine order, and the terrifying fact that a city can be full of people one day and silent the next. Plato's Atlantis gave us another version of the same fear. A powerful society, rich beyond imagination, confident in its own strength, destroyed in a single moment. Whether Atlantis was inspired by real events, political philosophy, older Mediterranean disaster memories, or Plato's own invention, its warning has outlived every attempt to locate it on a map. Then came the Yugas of Hindu thought, where the reset is not one event but a cycle. Ages rise, decline, collapse, and begin again. The universe itself moves through vast rhythms of creation and destruction. Not because history is meaningless, but because human beings repeatedly forget the balance that makes a world worth living in. The Zoroastrian story of the deadly winter takes us into a harsher landscape. A world threatened by cold darkness, famine, and the possibility that life must be protected inside a carefully prepared refuge. It may echo real environmental disasters. It may be spiritual teaching. It may be both woven together over generations. But its central image remains unforgettable. Survival depends on recognizing the danger before it arrives. The Maya creation accounts remind us that time is not always imagined as a straight line marching toward progress. Worlds can be made, tested, transformed and remade. Dates mattered, cycles mattered, the sky mattered. But these traditions were never a simple countdown to the end of everything, no matter how often modern culture tried to turn them into one. In the north, Ragnarök brought fire, flood, monsters, the death of gods, and the collapse of the familiar order. But even there, the story did not end in empty darkness. The earth rises again, survivors remain, a new world begins, not untouched by what happened but born from it, and in Hopi traditions approached with the respect they deserve, earlier worlds are not souvenirs for outsiders to collect or predictions to turn into viral content. They are teachings about responsibility, about what happens when human beings lose balance with each other, with the land, and with the obligations that hold a community together. 7 civilizations, 7 very different worlds, floods, winters, fire, cosmic cycles, lost islands, earlier ages, renewed Earth. Some of these stories may preserve distant memories of real floods, droughts, eruptions, migrations, and climate shocks. Archaeology, geology, genetics, and climate science can help us investigate those possibilities. But evidence has limits. A flood layer does not prove every detail of a sacred story. A myth does not become worthless because it cannot be read like a modern newspaper report. The deeper mystery is not that ancient people imagined disaster. They lived with it. They watched rivers rise. They saw fields fail. They survived epidemics, invasions, volcanic winters, collapsing kingdoms, and changing skies. They knew something modern societies often struggle to remember. Civilization is powerful, but it is never permanent. A world can end without the planet ending. It can end when food systems fail, when trust disappears, when leaders refuse to see danger, when knowledge is forgotten, when a society becomes so certain of its own permanence that it stops preparing for change. Maybe that is why these stories keep returning. Not because they are all describing the same lost world, but because they are describing the same human problem. We build, we grow, we become confident. We forget the conditions that made our success possible. Then reality reminds us that no civilization stands outside nature, time, or consequence. And yet every one of these traditions also preserves another idea: survival. A boat, a refuge, a remnant, a few people carrying memory through the darkness until conditions change. The reset is never only about destruction. It is about what deserves to be carried forward. So what would we carry? What knowledge, what values, what responsibilities would still matter if the systems we take for granted suddenly failed? Let me know what you think in the comments and tell me where you're listening from. If this journey through ancient mysteries made you see these old stories differently, please like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for the next one. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The link is in the description, because the ancient texts may not be giving us a timetable for the end of the world, but they may be asking a far more difficult question. When the next world begins, what kind of ancestors will we have chosen to be?